"Get down! The tree is coming down!" Annie screamed, her voice tearing through the storm. Charles Whitmore did not move. He stood in the rain with one hand lifted over his eyes, looking at her as if she were the one making trouble, not the mountain splitting apart behind him. His white shirt clung to his chest. His suit jacket hung heavy with rain. One of his Italian leather shoes had already disappeared into the mud, and the other was sinking deeper every time he shifted his weight. Still, the man had the nerve to look irritated. "Miss, I heard you," he said. "No, you didn't," Annie shouted. "If you heard me, you'd be on the ground." Behind him, the old tree groaned. Annie heard it beneath the thunder, low and deep, the sound of roots tearing through soaked earth. Most people did not know that sound. They expected trees to fall with a crack, sudden and clean, but an old tree gave warning first. It complained. It begged the ground to hold. It told the air it was about to let go. Charles Whitmore heard none of it. He glanced back toward his luxury SUV, half tilted near the edge of the washed-out road. Its hazard lights blinked weakly through the rain, like the car itself was losing consciousness. 20 minutes earlier, that vehicle had been his proof that nothing bad could happen to him. Heated seats, emergency system, satellite navigation, reinforced frame, a price tag big enough to buy half the houses in Hollow Creek. Now it was nothing but metal stuck in mud. "You need to get away from that slope," Annie said. "Right now." Charles looked at the dead phone in his hand. "My rescue team will be here soon." Annie stared at him. "No, they won't." His face tightened. "Excuse me? They won't get through. The creek's over the bridge, the south road is buried, and the ridge cut washes out first in a storm like this. Every way in is blocked. My people can track the car. The signal died before the rain got bad. There's satellite backup. Not in this hollow. Not tonight." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You seem very sure of yourself. I live here." Charles slipped the useless phone into his coat pocket, as if that settled the matter. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll wait for professionals." Annie blinked rain from her eyes. Professionals. She had followed his tire tracks after her shift at Miller's Gas and Grocery, because she knew Old Mill Road swallowed strangers in weather like this. She had walked into a storm to find him. She had warned him twice already. First at the gas station, when he asked for directions and smiled through her warning like she was telling a children's story. Then here, beside the SUV, when she showed him the cracks forming under the rear tires and the muddy water bubbling out of the hillside. Both times, he had looked at her and chosen not to listen. Now he was standing under a dying tree, still waiting for the world to obey his bank account. Annie's fear snapped into anger. "Are you out of your mind?" she shouted. Charles frowned. "Watch your tone." "My tone?" Annie stepped closer, rain dripping from her chin. "Sir, your car is dead, your phone is dead, the road is gone, and that tree is about to come down on your head. And you're worried about my tone? I'm not going to be ordered around by a stranger." "A stranger?" Annie laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You're the stranger. You don't know this road. You don't know this mountain. You don't know what that creek sounds like before it floods. You don't know what roots sound like before they tear loose." "I know panic when I hear it," Charles said. That was the last thing he should have said. Annie's hands curled into fists. "No, Mr. Whitmore, what you hear is the only person dumb enough to come looking for you before the mountain takes you." His eyes narrowed. She pointed at him, too angry now to soften the truth. "Has money made your head that cloudy? Is that it? You got so rich you can't hear common sense unless it comes from somebody in a suit? You think because you can buy land and cars and men with radios, you can buy 5 more minutes from a storm?" Charles opened his mouth, but Annie cut him off. "You're acting crazy," she shouted. "Not brave, not smart. Crazy, standing there under a dying tree, waiting for a rescue team that can't reach you, because you'd rather trust a dead machine than a black girl who knows the ground under your feet." Lightning flashed. For one bright second, the forest showed the truth. The slope behind Charles had split open. Mud slid in thick ropes around the roots of a massive tulip poplar. The tree leaned slightly, almost politely, but Annie saw the downhill roots rising from the earth like broken fingers. The trunk was hollow at the heart. The rain had finished what rot had started years before. Charles finally turned his head. The tree groaned again. This time, even he heard it. His expression changed, but not enough. Pride did not leave men like Charles all at once. It cracked first. It looked for one last excuse. It reached for one last reason to stay in charge. "That tree has stood there for 100 years, he said, though his voice had lost its edge. "And tonight it's done," Annie said. A piece of the road collapsed behind them with a wet, heavy crash. Charles flinched. The sound rolled down into Blackwater Run, where the floodwater carried branches, stones, and pieces of earth into the dark. Annie pointed toward a black opening between two slabs of rock several yards away. "Move to that hollow." Charles took one step, then looked back at the SUV. Annie's stomach dropped. "Don't you dare. My briefcase is in there." "Your briefcase?" "It has contracts, my laptop." "You won't need a laptop in a coffin." He hesitated. That hesitation told Annie everything. Even now, with rain beating his face and the mountain coming apart around him, some part of Charles Whitmore still believed paper mattered, contracts mattered, ownership mattered, his things mattered, more than his life, more than her warning, more than the truth standing in front of him. "Listen to me," Annie said, her voice lower now, rough with urgency. "Nobody is coming in time. Not your driver. Not your private rescue team. Not the county. The storm cut off every road into this hollow. Right now, the only help you have is me." For the first time, Charles looked at her, not at the torn raincoat, not at the mud on her jeans, not at the color of her skin, at her. The tree cracked. The sound split the air. Annie felt the blood leave her face. The trunk shifted. The crown tipped toward Charles with a slow, terrible certainty. Leaves tore loose and flew sideways in the wind. Branches snapped against other branches like bones breaking in the dark. "Get down!" she screamed again. Charles froze. Annie reached Charles just as the first heavy branch tore through the rain above him. She did not think about whether he deserved saving. There was no time for that. Her body moved before her anger could catch up. She hit him hard with her shoulder, both hands grabbing the front of his soaked coat, and drove him sideways with all the strength she had earned from hauling feed sacks, pushing broken carts at Miller's, and helping her grandmother split wet wood after storms. Charles stumbled, more shocked than cooperative. "What the hell are you?" "Run!" Annie shouted. The tree struck the slope behind them, not full force yet, but close enough that a branch slapped the ground where Charles had been standing. Mud exploded up his legs. He lost his balance, grabbed at Annie, and nearly dragged them both down. "Move your feet," she yelled. "I can't carry you." That seemed to wake him. He lurched forward, slipping, one bare sock in the mud where his missing shoe had been, one polished shoe sliding uselessly under him. Annie kept hold of his sleeve and pulled him toward the dark rock hollow she had pointed out seconds before. Mercy Hollow was not far, but the storm made every yard feel like a fight. Rain blinded them, wind shoved from the side. The ground under them shifted like something alive. Behind them, the tulip poplar gave another groan. Charles looked back. "Don't look," Annie snapped. "My car. Forget the damn car. It has emergency supplies. It's sitting on dead ground." He tried to twist toward it anyway, and Annie lost what little patience she had left. She shoved him in the chest again, hard enough to make him stagger. "You really are crazy," she shouted. "That car is not your mother. It is not your church. It is not going to save you. Move." His face flashed with anger. But the mountain answered before he could. The ground beneath the SUV cracked open with a sound like a giant board snapping. The rear tires dropped. The front end lifted for a second, headlights pointing at the trees as if the vehicle were looking for mercy. Then the whole SUV slid sideways, slow at first, then fast. Charles froze again. Annie grabbed his arm. "Charles!" It was the first time she had used his first name. Not sir. Not Mr. Whitmore. Just Charles. Sharp and human. It cut through him. The SUV scraped along the broken road, metal shrieking against stone. One door flew open. A leather briefcase tumbled out, hit the mud, and vanished under a rush of brown water. The hazard lights blinked twice, weaker each time. Then the slope gave up entirely. The vehicle rolled, struck a pine, spun half around, and disappeared down toward Blackwater Run. For a moment, all Charles could do was stare. The thing had cost more than the school Hollow Creek no longer had. It had carried him through cities, gated resorts, private drives, and valet lanes where people moved before he asked them to. Now the mountain had taken it without asking his name. "No," he whispered. Annie heard him, but she did not soften. Yes, now run. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about courage, justice, and the people we should never underestimate. The tree above them shifted again. Its fallen crown had caught against another trunk, but not for long. The second tree bent under the weight, roots lifting. Annie dragged Charles toward Mercy Hollow. The opening was narrow, half hidden by mountain laurel, a black gap between two slabs of stone. Ruth had shown it to Annie when she was 12, after a thunderstorm trapped them on the old trail. If the sky turns mean, her grandmother had said, you get inside rock. Trees fall. Roads wash. Rock remembers how to stay. They were 10 feet away when Charles slipped and went down on one knee. He cried out, grabbing his ankle. Annie turned back. Get up. I can't. Yes, you can. My ankle. You want to keep it attached to the rest of you? Get up. He looked at her then, breathing hard, rain running into his eyes. There was pain on his face, but beneath it there was something worse for a man like him, disbelief. His whole life had taught him that discomfort was temporary, solvable, billable. Someone else always carried the bags, fixed the tire, drove through the weather, handled the hard ground. Now pain had found him where money could not send an assistant. Annie reached down. Take my hand. He hesitated. Even now, Annie stared at him. Are you too proud to be saved, or just too stupid to know you need it? His jaw clenched, but he took her hand. She pulled. He pushed off with his good foot, groaning as he stood. His weight nearly took her down, but she planted both boots in the mud and leaned backward until he found balance. Another crack split the air. The second tree was giving way. Inside, Annie said, they stumbled the last few feet. Charles ducked into the hollow first, hitting his shoulder against the stone. Annie shoved him deeper in and turned back to look at the slope. She needed to know whether they were safe. Ruth had taught her that too. Never trust the first danger to be the last. The fallen tree shifted, rolling down the slope as the second trunk snapped. A branch whipped toward the hollow entrance. Annie jumped back, but not fast enough. The end of it struck her upper arm and spun her hard against the rock. Pain shot through her shoulder. She bit down on a cry. Charles grabbed her from behind and pulled her fully inside. It was clumsy, too hard, almost panicked, but it worked. The branch slammed across the entrance, showering them with leaves and mud. For several seconds, the world outside was only noise. Wood breaking, rain pounding, water rushing, stones knocking loose and tumbling down the slope. Then, not silence, but a smaller kind of storm. Annie slid down against the rock wall, holding her arm tight to her ribs. Her breath came in short bursts. Charles crouched beside her, soaked and shivering, his face pale in the dim light. You're bleeding, he said. Annie looked at the dark smear on her sleeve. I noticed. What do I do? She almost laughed. 15 minutes ago, he had acted like she was a nuisance. Now he was waiting for instructions like a scared boy in church. First, she said, forcing the words through her teeth, stop looking at me like I'm already dead. He swallowed. I'm not. Yes, you are. He looked away, ashamed or angry. Annie could not tell which. Maybe both. Water ran down the rock near the entrance. The hollow smelled of wet stone, crushed leaves, and old earth. It was cramped, barely large enough for both of them if Charles kept his knees drawn up. Outside, the road to the west was gone. The route back toward Miller's was buried. Blackwater Run was rising. Every way in and out had been cut off. Just as Annie had told him, Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. He pressed the power button. Nothing happened. Annie watched him. He pressed it harder. Still nothing. Save the battery, she said. It's dead. Then save yourself the disappointment. He lowered the phone slowly. For the first time since she had found him, Charles Whitmore looked less like a man who had been inconvenienced and more like a man who understood he was trapped. How long until rescue gets here? He asked. Annie listened to the rain, to the water below, to the wind moving across the ridge. She thought of the bridge near the creek, the low place by the south cut, the old section of road where mud always crossed first. She thought of Marcus Hale and his volunteer crew trying to get through with chainsaws and flashlights. Good men, brave men, but not magic. Not tonight, she said. Charles stared at her. You don't know that. I do. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The argument had gone out of him, or maybe the storm had beaten it out. Annie leaned her head back against the rock and shut her eyes for 1 second. Only one. She could not afford more. Her shoulder throbbed. Her arm felt wrong. The cold was already slipping through her wet clothes. She needed to think like Ruth had taught her. Injury, shelter, water, heat, signal. One thing at a time. Panic killed people faster than weather. Take off your jacket, she said. Charles blinked. What? Your jacket. Take it off. He obeyed, awkwardly peeling the soaked fabric from his arms. She nodded toward the entrance. Stuff part of it in that gap. Not all the way. We need air. Just enough to slow the rain. He moved, then stopped. What about you? I said the gap, not my funeral. He did as told. Annie watched him wedge the expensive jacket between two rocks, ruining it beyond saving. For some reason, that made the night feel slightly less impossible. Outside, the storm kept tearing at the mountain. Inside Mercy Hollow, Charles Whitmore sat in the mud beside the girl he had refused to trust. And for the first time, he waited for her to tell him how to live. Charles sat with his back against the rock and watched his jacket drink rainwater from the gap at the entrance. 10 minutes ago, he would have thrown that jacket away without thinking. Now it was the only thing slowing the storm from reaching them. Annie sat across from him, knees pulled close, one hand pressed against her upper arm. She was trying not to show pain. Charles knew that kind of restraint. He had seen it in employees who needed a paycheck too badly to complain, in waiters who smiled after being insulted, in men on construction sites who kept working with bad backs because nobody paid them to heal. He had seen it often. He had rarely cared. How bad is your arm? He asked. Still attached. That's not an answer. It's the answer you get. He looked toward the entrance. Rain hammered the rock. Beyond it, the fallen tree blocked most of the opening, its branches shifting whenever the wind pushed through the hollow. The world outside was dark except when lightning broke it open. Each flash showed the slope torn apart, mud sliding over roots, water cutting new paths where the road used to be. Charles reached for his phone again, then stopped before touching it. Annie noticed. It won't work just because you want it to. I know. Do you? He let the hand fall. I'm trying. That's new. He looked at her. She did not look sorry for saying it. For a while, they listened to the storm. Charles was not used to listening to anything he could not control. Boardrooms had noise, but it was organized noise. Voices waiting for him. Screens lighting up when he walked in. Assistants placing the right folder beside his hand. Even silence in his world had manners. This silence did not. It pressed on him between thunderclaps and made him hear his own breathing. My team will keep looking, he said, though the words sounded weaker than before. Annie closed her eyes. I didn't say they wouldn't look. I said they won't get here tonight. You don't know my people. I know these roads. There are emergency vehicles. There are washed-out bridges. They have helicopters. Not in this wind. They'll call the county. The county's got 3 crews and half the mountain falling on all of them. Charles stared into the dark. You seem to have an answer for everything. No, Annie said. I just don't have the luxury of pretending. That landed harder than he expected. He shifted his injured ankle and winced. Annie opened one eye. Don't move it like that. I didn't ask for medical advice. You asked how long until rescue. Now you're getting the rest for free. Despite himself, he almost smiled. It vanished quickly when pain climbed up his leg. Annie saw it. Take off the shoe. What? Your ankle's swelling. Take off the shoe before it gets stuck. It's fine. It's not fine. He looked down at the remaining Italian shoe, caked with red mud, the leather bent and scarred. It had been handmade in Milan. His assistant had brought it to his office in a gray box with tissue paper folded around it like it was something sacred. Now Annie was looking at it like it was a problem to solve. Mr. Whitmore, she said, tired but sharp, if you argue with me over a shoe, I may let the mountain finish raising you. He gave her a look. You talk to everyone like that? Only men who make bad decisions in expensive footwear. He exhaled through his nose, then bent down and pulled at the shoe. The pain in his ankle made his face tighten. Annie leaned forward, but he raised a hand. I can do it. Then do it. He got it off after a struggle. His sock was soaked, his ankle already swelling. Annie studied it from across the hollow. Not broken, she said. Sprained, maybe. You can walk when we have to, but not fast. When we have to? She tilted her head toward the entrance. If water starts coming in, if more trees fall, if the hollow shifts, shelter is only shelter while it holds. Iblia 19 so. She dealt her Braika, Mar, or Pockley, and so, Charles looked at the stone around them. I thought this place was safe. It's safer. That's not the same thing. He leaned his head back and shut his eyes. Of course it isn't. His voice sounded older now, not 50, older. Annie heard exhaustion in it, and something else beginning to crack. She did not trust it yet. Men like Charles could seem humble when they were cold and scared, then put their pride back on with a dry suit. What were you doing on Old Mill Road? She asked. His eyes opened. He took too long to answer. Annie gave a short laugh. That bad? I was looking at land. I know whose land. It isn't that simple. It never is when people with money want something. He rubbed rain from his face. My company is considering development in the area. Development, she repeated. That's a clean word. It means jobs. For who? For the community. You asked the community? Charles looked away. Annie nodded slowly. That's what I thought. You don't know what the project includes. I know it includes roads that cut through hunting trails. I know it includes fencing near Blackwater Run. I know it includes rich folks paying to look at mountains they don't have to survive. He turned back to her. You've seen the plans? I work at the gas station. Men like your friend Victor stop for coffee and talk loud when they think nobody important is listening. At the mention of Victor, Charles's mouth tightened. Annie caught it. He told Earl Miller this place was underused. Said people here were sitting on value they didn't understand. Charles said nothing. My grandmother uses those woods for medicine. Marcus Hale uses those trails when somebody gets hurt and roads are blocked. Kids fish that creek. Families get firewood. Where you want to put private cabins. But sure, underused. I didn't come here to take from anybody. No, you came here to buy it first. That makes it sound polite. The storm rolled over them again. Charles felt the words settle into places he had kept well defended for years. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say there would be permits, compensation, environmental review, scholarships maybe, a community fund if public relations suggested it. He had a language for softening hard things. Annie did not seem interested in that language. What do you want me to say? He asked. Nothing. That's convenient. No, Annie said. It's honest. I don't need you to give me a speech while we're sitting in a hole in the mountain. I need you to stay alive, keep pressure off that ankle, and stop reaching for a phone that can't save you. He looked at her, and for the first time he saw past the anger. She was scared. Not of him. Not exactly. Scared of the storm, of her injury, of the long night ahead, but still thinking, still measuring sounds outside, still deciding what had to be done next. He wondered how many years a person had to live without being rescued before they learned to become rescue for someone else. What's your grandmother's name? He asked. Annie's face changed at once, guarded. Why? You mentioned her. Ruth. She taught you this? She taught me to listen. The mountain taught me the rest. He nodded. My father used to say something like that. Not about mountains. About people. What happened? I got rich enough to forget. Annie looked at him for a long moment. The answer surprised her because it sounded true. A burst of wind shoved rain through the jacket at the entrance. Charles moved to fix it, but Annie lifted her good hand. Wait. He froze. She listened. The sound came again, faint under the storm. Not thunder, not branches, not water. A dull shifting above them, like weight moving through mud. Charles whispered, What is it? Annie's face went still. More of the slope, she said. Not on us yet. Yet? She pushed herself straighter, fighting pain. There's a deeper part of this hollow. Back left. Crawl slow. Don't put weight on the bad ankle if you can help it. What about you? I'll move. You can't use that arm. Then I'll use the other one. He hesitated, then reached toward her, not commanding this time, offering. Annie looked at his hand. Outside, the slope shifted again. This time, she took it. Charles's hand was cold, but his grip was careful. That surprised Annie more than it should have. She had expected him to pull too hard, to panic, to forget her shoulder and drag her like luggage. Instead, he waited until she shifted her weight, then moved with her, slow and awkward, one knee at a time toward the darker part of the hollow. The back of Mercy Hollow narrowed before it opened again, like the mountain had hidden a second room inside the first. Ruth had shown Annie this place years ago, and made her crawl through it 3 times in daylight before she trusted her to remember it in a storm. Fear makes every hole look smaller, Ruth had told her, so learn it before fear gets there. Annie remembered, left knee first. Keep the bad side away from the stone. Duck before the ceiling drops. Watch for the loose rock near the bend. Charles did not know any of that. His shoulder struck the wall once, and he sucked in a breath. His injured ankle dragged behind him. He did not complain, which Annie noticed. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe he was learning. Lower, she said. He ducked. Left hand on the wall. Not there. That stone shifts. He moved his hand. Good. The word slipped out before she could stop it. Charles looked back at her, rainwater dripping from his jaw. Did you just compliment me? Don't ruin it. He almost smiled, then the slope outside groaned again. The sound killed whatever was about to reach his face. A rush of mud slid past the front opening of the hollow, covering part of the fallen branches. Water splashed in, then thinned. If they had stayed where they were, it would have hit their legs. Charles stared at the brown flow moving across the place they had just left. Annie leaned against the rock and closed her eyes for one breath. That's why we moved. I see that. No, you're starting to. He accepted that without answering. They reached the deeper pocket of stone. It was cramped but drier, protected by an overhang and a shelf of rock that kept most of the wind out. Annie sank down with her back against the wall. Pain spread across her shoulder in waves. Her arm felt heavy, wrong, as if it belonged to somebody else and had been placed beside her by mistake. Charles lowered himself across from her. His bad ankle stretched out. He looked too large for the space. A rich man folded into the mountain like he had been put where he never belonged. Let me see your arm, he said. No. Annie. She looked at him. You don't get to say my name like that yet. He took the correction quietly. Then tell me how to help. The question was better. Not perfect, but better. Annie glanced down at her sleeve. The branch had torn through the raincoat and shirt beneath it. Blood had darkened the fabric near her upper arm. But the bleeding was slow. The shoulder hurt worse than the cut. She tried to lift her right hand and hissed through her teeth. Charles moved forward. Don't. I know not to move it. Then why did you? To see how bad it was? And? Bad. He waited for more. She did not give it. Charles looked around, searching for something useful. There was nothing but stone, mud, broken leaves, his ruined jacket in the front gap, and the two of them. His world had trained him to expect supplies, kits, staff, clean white towels, someone with a clipboard. Here, help had to be made out of whatever had survived. Your tie, Annie said. He touched his neck like he had forgotten he was wearing one. Take it off. He pulled it loose. It was dark blue, expensive, soaked. Annie nodded toward her arm. Fold it. Not too tight. We need to keep my shoulder from moving. His hands hesitated over the fabric. I don't know how. Fold it long. Like a sling. He tried. It came out clumsy. Not like you're wrapping a Christmas ham, Annie muttered. He looked up. I don't wrap Christmas hams. Of course you don't. Despite the pain, she talked him through it. He folded the tie, then used part of his shirt cuff to pad the side of her arm. He worked slowly, jaw tight, watching her face each time the cloth brushed the injury. When she flinched, he stopped. Keep going, she said. I'm hurting you. You stopping won't heal me. He finished tying the sling. It was ugly, but it held. Annie let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Better? He asked. Less loose. I'll take that. The storm pressed against the hollow again. Thunder rolled so close the stone seemed to vibrate. Charles looked toward the front opening. What happens if the water rises? Depends how high. And if it reaches us? We move farther back if we can. If we can't? Annie looked at him. Then we pray you suddenly get good at listening. He nodded once. Fair. That single word hung between them. It was not an apology, but it was the first honest thing that did not defend him. Minutes passed. Annie could feel the cold working through her wet clothes. She rubbed her left hand against her thigh to keep the fingers awake. Charles noticed, pulled the remains of his shirt loose from under his vest, and tore at the hem. "What are you doing?" "Making something dry." "It's not dry." "Less wet then." He tore a strip and handed it to her. She wrapped it around her left hand. The gesture was small, too small to erase what he had said, too small to change what he represented, but not small enough to mean nothing. "Why were you really on Old Mill Road?" she asked. "I told you. Land." "No, rich men don't drive themselves into dead roads before a storm unless they're trying to prove something." Charles looked down at his sock, muddy and soaked. "Victor said waiting made me look uncertain." Annie gave him a look. "So you let a man in clean shoes send you into a mountain storm?" "He didn't send me. I chose to go. Because you didn't want to look weak." Charles did not answer. Annie leaned her head back against the stone. "That's how people get killed out here. Not weakness, pretending they don't have any." He looked at her for a long time. "You're 18? "Yes." "You sound older. I've been poor a long time." The words came out plain, not bitter, and maybe that made them worse. Charles looked away. "My father grew up poor," he said after a while. "Small house outside Wheeling. Coal country. He hated talking about it after he made money." "Did he forget it?" "No, he buried it." "Same thing, if you bury it deep enough." Charles breathed out slowly. "Maybe." Annie studied him. "And you?" "I inherited the part he built and expanded it." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her then. She did not soften the question. "Did you forget where he came from?" Outside, rain filled the pause. "I think," Charles said carefully, "I learned to be embarrassed by it for him." Annie was quiet. That was the first answer from him that sounded like it cost something. "My mama used to clean classrooms," she said, "before the flood. She said she liked empty rooms after the children left because you could still feel what they were trying to become." Charles listened. "She wanted me to teach. Said Hollow Creek needed teachers who didn't look at poor kids like they were already done. Do you still want that?" Annie's jaw tightened. "Wanting doesn't build schools." "No," he said, "it doesn't." The old Charles might have added something about grants or partnerships or long-term planning. This Charles said nothing, because in that hollow, with his ankle swelling and Annie's blood on his tie, the usual words would have sounded cheap. A faint sound cut through the rain. Charles straightened. "What was that?" Annie lifted her head. For a second she thought it was another slide, but then it came again, distant and thin. A voice, then another. Charles's face lit with hope. "Rescue?" Annie listened harder. The wind twisted the sound, carried it away, brought it back. Not close, not steady. Could be Marcus. Could be someone calling from the ridge before turning back. Could be nothing but the storm making liars out of trees. Charles started to move toward the entrance. Annie caught his sleeve with her good hand. "Don't. If they're out there, if you crawl out and the slope drops, they'll be looking for 2 bodies instead of 2 people." He stopped, but the hope on his face hurt to watch. "We need to signal," he said. "With what?" "My phone has a flashlight. It's dead. Maybe enough for 1 burst. Save it until we know they're close." He sat back, frustrated. "So we just wait?" Annie listened to the voices fade into the storm. Her chest tightened. Waiting had killed her mother. Waiting was the thing she hated most. But bad movement killed people too. "We stay alive first," she said. "Then we get found." Charles looked at her, and this time he did not argue. Outside Mercy Hollow, the voices disappeared. Inside, the cold settled deeper. Annie kept her eyes open, counting thunder, counting breaths, counting the seconds between each shift of the mountain. Charles sat across from her, no longer reaching for the phone, no longer giving orders. For now, that was enough. Charles tried to keep track of time, but the storm took that from him too. There was no clock in Mercy Hollow, no signal, no clean division between 1 minute and the next. There was only rain, thunder, the sound of water chewing at the mountain, and Annie's breathing, which had grown shallow enough to worry him. "You still awake?" he asked. Annie opened her eyes halfway. "I was enjoying the peace before you talked." He almost smiled. "Good. Insulting me means you're conscious. Don't get used to it." Her voice was weaker than before. That scared him more than the storm. Charles had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people trained to make problems smaller before they reached him. Pain was softened by private doctors. Delays were handled by assistants. Risk was measured in reports with charts. But Annie's pain had no chart. It sat across from him in a torn raincoat, wrapped in his ruined tie, and made him feel useless. "You're cold," he said. "So are you." "Annie." "What?" "Tell me what to do." She looked at him through the dimness. The old irritation was still there, but it had less fire behind it now. "You keep asking that like I'm hiding a rescue helicopter in my pocket." "I'm asking because you know more than I do." That made her quiet. Outside, thunder rolled over the ridge. Somewhere beyond the fallen tree, a stream of rocks tumbled down the slope and struck the trunk blocking the entrance. Charles flinched. Annie did not. She only turned her head a little, listening. "Not close enough," she murmured. "How can you tell? Sound changes when it's coming for you." Charles let that sit. "That's a terrible thing to know. It keeps people alive." He nodded. Then, because silence had started to feel like a room full of things he did not want to face, he said, "You were right about the roads." Annie's eyes shifted toward him. "I shouldn't have dismissed you," he said. The words came out stiff. He had apologized in public before, but usually through statements, lawyers, or carefully worded interviews after some project upset people with less power than he had. This was different. There was no microphone to impress, no board to reassure. Just a girl who had bled because he had not listened. Annie waited. Charles swallowed. "I was arrogant." "Were?" He looked down. "Am. That's better. I thought I knew what I was doing." "You thought being rich was the same as being right." He did not answer because she had put it too cleanly. Annie shifted and winced. Charles moved without thinking, then stopped himself. "Can I check the sling? You know what you're looking at?" "No." "Then no." He sat back. A few moments passed before she sighed. "Fine. Check if it's slipping. Don't touch the shoulder." He leaned closer, slow enough that she could stop him. The strip of tie still held, but the knot had loosened where rain had soaked through it. His fingers were clumsy, chilled and stiff. Annie talked him through tightening it. "Not there. Under. Pull the cloth, not my arm." "I'm trying. I can tell." "That's the problem." He let out a breath that was nearly a laugh. "You always this hard on people helping you? You're new at it. I'm giving instruction." He retied the knot, and she closed her eyes until the pain passed. "There," he said. "Better? It'll do." That small approval warmed him more than it should have. Then Annie opened her eyes and stared toward the entrance again. "What?" Charles asked. "Water's louder." He listened. At first he heard only rain, but then he caught it. A deeper rush beneath the rest, steady and rising. "Blackwater Run?" he asked. "Part of it, part of everything now. Are we in danger here?" "Not yet." He disliked those two words more each time she used them. Annie braced her left hand on the ground and tried to sit straighter. Her face tightened. Charles reached out, and this time she did not snap at him when he helped. He shifted closer so she could lean against the rock without putting weight on her injured side. "We may need to get higher in the hollow," she said. "I thought this was the higher part." "It is." "That's not comforting." "It wasn't meant to be." The water outside slapped against stone, then receded. A gust of wind pushed rain through the blocked entrance and sprayed both of them. Annie looked at the fallen branches, then at Charles's empty hands. "Do you still have that belt?" He stared. "My belt? Unless your pants came with a trust fund." "Yes, your belt." "In my pants, Annie. I'm injured, not blind. Take it off. We can use it to tie that branch tighter across the gap, slow the water." Charles hesitated for half a second, then did as told. The absurdity of the moment struck him. Charles Whitmore, who had once delayed a shareholder vote because the conference room chairs were the wrong shade of gray, sitting in a cave in one sock while an 18-year-old girl ordered him to remove his belt so they could keep from drowning. Annie watched him fumble with the buckle. "Don't look so tragic. It's a belt, not a kidney." He gave her a tired look. "You're enjoying this. I'd enjoy it more if my arm wasn't trying to leave my body." He crawled toward the entrance, dragging his bad ankle behind him. Annie guided him from where she sat. "Loop it around that thick branch." "No, the other one. The one wedged under the rock." "I see it. You said that about the tree." He paused. "Fair." He worked the belt around the branch and pulled it toward the stone shelf. Mud covered his hands. Bark scraped his knuckles. The branch shifted, and cold rainwater splashed across his face. He cursed under his breath but kept working. "Pull it tight," Annie said. "I am. Tighter. The belt might snap. Then it dies doing something useful." He looked back at her, and she looked so serious that he did not know whether to laugh or worry. He pulled harder. The branch settled into place, blocking more of the gap. Water still came through, but less of it. Charles crawled back, breathing hard. "There. Good." He sat down across from her. That one sounded like a real compliment. "Don't push your luck." For a while, they listened again. The water outside rushed past but no longer sprayed as hard into the deeper hollow. Charles rubbed his hands together, trying to get feeling back into his fingers. "My daughter used to hate storms," he said suddenly. Annie looked at him. "You have a daughter?" "Had." The correction hung in the small space between them. Annie's expression changed, not soft exactly, but less guarded. "I'm sorry. Thank you." He looked at the wet stone near his feet. "Emily." She was 8. "Leukemia." Annie said nothing. Some grief did not want a quick answer. "She used to come into my office when thunder started," Charles said. "Crawl under the desk. I'd keep working and pretend I didn't notice so she wouldn't feel embarrassed. She knew I noticed." "How long ago?" 16 years. "That's a long time to miss somebody." "Yes." Rain drummed overhead. Charles pressed his thumb into his palm, grounding himself. "After she died, I worked, bought more land, built more places. I told myself movement was better than sitting still. Did it help? No." He looked at Annie. "It made me rich enough that people stopped asking if I was all right." Annie's eyes moved to the blocked entrance. "Poor people get the opposite. Everybody sees you struggling, but they still don't ask." That struck him with a quiet force. "My mama died when I was 9, Annie said after a while. "Flood took the lower road. Ambulance couldn't get through. Ruth kept saying help was coming because that's what grown folks say when children are scared." Charles lowered his gaze. "But I watched her face," Annie continued. "I knew before she said it. Help wasn't coming fast enough. The hollow seemed smaller after that." "I'm sorry," Charles said. Annie nodded once. "That's why I came after you. I hate waiting for people who may not get there." Charles looked at her injured arm, the mud on her jeans, the exhaustion she was fighting. "And I made it harder." "Yes." He almost flinched at the plainness of it. Then she added, "But you're listening now." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door cracked open. A faint sound rose outside. Charles stiffened. "Voices?" Annie lifted her head. The sound came again, thin and broken by wind. Not voices. A siren. Far away. Maybe on the ridge road. Maybe down by the washed-out bridge. It wailed once, then faded. Charles's face tightened with hope and fear. "They're close." "No," Annie said. "They're trying to find a way in. But that means they know we're missing." "Maybe." "Maybe? Could be for somebody else. Storm like this, we're not the only trouble on the mountain." The siren faded completely. Charles leaned back, closing his eyes. The hope left him in a way that made Annie look away. She knew that feeling too well. "Hey," she said. He opened his eyes. "You want to help?" "Yes." "Stay awake." He nodded. "All right. If I start drifting, talk." "About what?" "I don't care. Just not money." He gave a low, tired laugh. "That narrows my life considerably." "Good, build a new one." He looked at her, and outside the storm kept tearing at the mountain, but inside Mercy Hollow, something quieter had begun to shift. Not rescue, not safety, not yet. But Charles Whitmore, for the first time in many years, was being asked to be useful without being important. And he was trying. Charles talked because Annie told him to, but at first he was bad at it. He spoke like a man giving a report to a room of tired executives. Dates, places, names of hotels he had built, cities where he owned towers, contracts that had taken years to close. Annie listened for less than a minute before opening one eye. "I said talk," she muttered, "not put me in a board meeting." Charles stopped. "I'm not used to this." To talking? To talking when nobody wants anything from me." Annie looked at him through the half-dark. "That might be the saddest rich man sentence I ever heard." He gave a tired breath that almost became a laugh. "I suppose it is. Try again." He leaned his head against the rock and watched water bead along the low ceiling of Mercy Hollow. Emily liked pancakes shaped like animals. I was terrible at making them. Bears looked like rocks. Rabbits looked like fried gloves. She didn't care. She'd name them before eating them. Annie's eyes stayed open this time. She had this way of correcting adults without making them feel stupid, Charles said. Doctors, nurses, me, especially me. Once, I told her I had an important call and couldn't stay for a movie. She said, "Daddy, if it's important, it'll still be important after the movie." Smart girl. Yes, his voice thinned. She was. Annie shifted slightly. Pain crossed her face before she hit it. Charles noticed. Your shoulder? Still attached, remember? You're getting pale. I'm black. You know what I mean. She did. She was cold and losing strength. The bleeding had slowed, but the impact from the branch had gone deep. Her whole right side felt swollen and hot, under the chill of her clothes. She needed a doctor. So did Charles, though he did not know how bad shock could get in a man his age after hours in wet clothes with an injured ankle. She listened again. Rain, water, wind, the low grinding of the slope outside. No voices. No sirens now. Keep talking, she said. Charles swallowed. After Emily died, people were kind for about 2 weeks. Then they became careful. Nobody wanted to mention her name. My board sent flowers. My friends sent whiskey. My wife and I stopped knowing how to sit in the same room. You divorced? 3 years later. Because of Emily? Because we grieved in different directions. She wanted to remember out loud. I wanted to build something tall enough to stand above it. Annie closed her eyes but kept listening. Did it work? No. Buildings don't raise the dead. No, he said. They don't. Another sound came from outside, sharper than before. Annie opened her eyes at once. Charles saw the change. What? Quiet. The mountain shifted again. But this time it was not the big slope. It was closer to the entrance. Near the fallen branches Charles had tied with his belt. Water had collected behind the debris. The flow pressed against the makeshift barrier, then retreated, then pressed again. Annie tried to sit up. Charles moved toward her. Don't help unless I ask. You look like you're about to fall over. I said don't help unless I ask. He stopped, hands raised slightly. She pushed herself upright with her good arm and studied the dark shape near the entrance. The branch is trapping water. I thought we wanted it blocked. We wanted rain slowed, not a pond built in our doorway. What do we do? She took a breath. You have to loosen the belt. Not all the way, just enough to let water pass. Charles looked toward the entrance. Wind drove rain through the leaves. Mud slid in little streams around the rock. The entrance was only a few feet away, but it felt like the mouth of something waiting. All right, he said. Crawl low. Keep your bad foot behind you. If the branch shifts, move back fast. I understand. You said that about the tree too. He looked at her. I deserved that. Yes, you did. He crawled toward the entrance, one hand on the wall, the other dragging through mud. His ankle throbbed with each movement. The belt was slick, tight around the branch where he had cinched it too well. Water pushed against the bundle, making it tremble. Which side? He asked. Left buckle. Pull the tongue back. Slow. He worked at it, fingers numb. The belt did not move. It stuck. Don't yank. I'm not. You're thinking about yanking. I am, but I'm growing as a person. Despite everything, Annie gave a short laugh, then winced. Don't make me laugh. It hurts. Charles got the belt loose by one notch. Water burst through the gap and splashed across his arm. He jerked back but held on. Good, Annie said. One more. He loosened it again. This time the water found a channel and began to drain past the branch instead of building behind it. The pressure eased. Then the mud under Charles's left hand slipped. His elbow dropped. His bad ankle twisted. He grunted, caught himself on the branch, and for 1 second the whole mass shifted toward him. Back, Annie shouted. Charles threw himself backward. The branch rolled half an inch, enough to send a sheet of cold water into the hollow, but the belt caught and held. He scrambled away from the entrance and collapsed beside Annie, breathing hard. They stared at the branch. It stayed. Charles laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because fear needed somewhere to go. Annie looked at him. You okay? He nodded. I think so. Uncle. Angry. Let it be angry. Angry means alive. He sat back, soaked all over again. I helped. You did one thing. I helped with one thing. That's how helping works. He looked at his muddy hands. Something in his face shifted, small but real. Nobody has needed me like that in a long time. Annie rested her head against the stone. Plenty of people probably needed you. You just had people between you and them. Charles did not answer quickly. The water now moved past the entrance, instead of pushing in. The deeper hollow remained damp but safe for the moment. Annie's breathing eased a little, though pain still tightened her mouth. What was your mother's name? Charles asked. Annie looked at him, cautious. You don't have to tell me, he added. Lena. Lena Carter? Annie nodded. She worked at the old elementary school before they shut half of it down. Not a teacher. Not officially. A classroom aide. But kids went to her more than the teachers sometimes. She kept snacks in her desk because some of them came hungry. Charles listened without interrupting. She used to say a child can't learn with an empty stomach and wet socks. Folks laughed, but she meant it. She'd wash coats at our house when parents couldn't afford the laundromat. She'd send books home in grocery bags and pretend she didn't care if they came back. She sounds remarkable. She was tired, Annie said. People always call poor women remarkable after they work themselves to the bone. Charles looked down. You're right. Still, she was. Annie's voice softened despite herself. She wanted a real school here. Not kids riding an hour and a half in winter. Not classrooms with buckets under leaks. A real one. That's what you wanted too. I still want it. Then why aren't you in college? She opened her eyes and gave him a flat look. You want the polite answer or the real one? The real one. Money, Ruth's medicine, the truck, groceries, the county cutting bus routes, life. He nodded slowly. I asked a stupid question. Rich people do that when they forget bills are not background noise. The words should have stung. They did. But he did not resent them. Not anymore. A long silence followed. This time it was not empty. It held Emily, Lena, Ruth, roads washed out, schools closed, cars gone, and two people the world had placed far apart sitting close enough to hear each other breathe. Then Charles said, if we get out of here. When, Annie corrected. He looked at her. When we get out, she said. Don't start burying us early. All right, he said. When we get out, I want to see Hollow Creek properly. Annie gave a tired snort. Properly? I mean not from a development map. That map won't show you much worth seeing. No, I'm beginning to understand that. Outside, the storm still moved over the mountain, but its rage had changed. The rain remained heavy, yet the wind came in shorter bursts. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled away instead of closer. Annie heard it. So did Charles. Is that good? He asked. It's not bad. For you, that's practically optimism. Don't get emotional. He looked toward the entrance. What happens at first light? If the slope holds, we look for higher ground and a signal. If I can walk. And if you can't? Annie did not answer. Charles did not let the silence finish. Then I carry you. She turned her head, eyebrow raised. With that ankle? I'll manage. You couldn't manage a mud road in one shoe. I'm learning. Annie studied him. He was still Charles Whitmore. Rich, proud, untested in the ways that mattered out here. But he had crawled into mud, loosened the branch, listened when told, and said, when, instead of if, because she told him to. That was not redemption, but it was movement. Get some rest, she said. You told me to stay awake. I changed my mind. 10 minutes, then talk again. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. The words were automatic, but not mocking. In the dark, Annie almost smiled. Charles closed his eyes, and Annie stayed awake, listening to the mountain, to the water, to the breathing of the man she had not let die. Somewhere beyond the storm, Hollow Creek waited with its broken roads and hungry children and old people who knew too much about being forgotten. Annie did not know yet what Charles Whitmore would do when the world gave him back his power. But in Mercy Hollow, stripped of everything but breath, he had begun to hear. Charles slept for 7 minutes. Annie counted them by breath and thunder. His head had tipped against the rock, mouth slightly open, one hand still resting near the belt that held the branch in place. He looked older in sleep, less powerful, less polished. Without the straight back and sharp voice, he was just a tired man with mud on his face and grief buried in the lines around his mouth. Then a drop of cold water hit Annie's cheek. She opened her eyes fully, Another drop landed on her wrist. Then another, faster. She looked up. Water had begun to seep through a thin crack in the stone above the back pocket of the hollow. It was not pouring yet, but the rhythm was wrong. Steady water meant pressure somewhere behind the rock. Pressure meant the mountain was still shifting. "Charles," she said. He woke at once, startled. "What?" "Don't jump. Just listen." He held still. The storm outside had weakened, but the hollow had grown louder. Water no longer rushed only past the entrance. It trickled behind them too, running through seams in the stone. Annie knew that sound. It meant the ground above Mercy Hollow was saturated. Charles looked up and saw the dripping. "Is that bad?" "It's not good. You said the hollow was safe." "I said safer." He rubbed both hands over his face. "I'm starting to hate that distinction." "Good. It might keep you alive." She tried to push herself upright. Pain grabbed her shoulder so hard she had to stop and breathe through her teeth. Charles moved toward her. "Let me." This time she did not refuse. He slipped one arm behind her back, careful of the injured side, and helped her sit straighter. She hated needing it. She hated even more that he was gentle. "We need to move?" he asked. "Maybe not far. There's a ledge higher up in the back. If water keeps coming through, we sit there." He looked into the dark rear of the hollow. "How do you know there's a ledge?" "Because when I was 12, Ruth made me crawl through this place until I could do it with my eyes closed." "She sounds strict. She kept me alive, didn't she?" "Yes," he said. "She did." Annie pointed with her chin. "There. See where the rock turns lighter?" Charles squinted. "Barely. That's the ledge. You go first. Your ankle won't like it, but it's better than drowning polite." "I don't think drowning has manners. You try to make it sign a contract." He gave a short breath, almost a laugh, then started toward the ledge. He moved slowly, dragging his bad ankle, using both hands on the stone. Annie watched every motion. He was learning to test before trusting his weight, learning not to assume ground would hold because he wanted it to. The mountain was teaching him in a language he could not ignore. When he reached the ledge, he turned and held out a hand. "All right, come on." Annie stared at the distance. It was only a few feet, but her body felt far away from her will. Her right arm was useless, and the cold had stiffened her legs. Charles saw the hesitation. He did not comment on it. That was good. Pride was sometimes the last dry thing a person had. "Take your time," he said. "I don't need you talking soft at me." "I'm not. I'm talking accurate." She looked at him despite herself. "You been saving that?" "No, I'm improvising. Poorly. Very." She crawled toward the ledge with her left hand and both knees. Halfway there, her injured arm shifted in the sling, and the pain turned sharp enough to blur the stone in front of her. She stopped, breathing hard. Charles lowered himself from the ledge. "Annie, don't. I'm not asking permission to keep you from falling." Before she could answer, another burst of water trickled down the back wall and spread across the floor where she had been sitting moments ago. That settled the argument. Charles slid one arm around her waist, kept clear of her shoulder, and helped lift her onto the ledge. It was clumsy and painful, but she made it. She leaned back against the stone, sweating under the cold. Charles sat beside her, breathing hard. "You all right?" "No." He nodded. "Thank you for not lying. I don't have the energy." The water gathered below them, shallow but spreading. It reflected small flashes of lightning from the entrance. The storm had not ended. It had moved into the earth. Charles watched the thin sheet of water creep over the floor. "If we had stayed down there, we'd be wet up to our hips soon. Cold would do the rest." He swallowed. "How many times have you done this? Hidden in rocks during storms?" "Yes. A few. As a child. Mostly." He looked at her. "That shouldn't sound normal." It wasn't normal. It was just ours. The words quieted him. Annie closed her eyes, but she did not sleep. Her body wanted to, which worried her. Ruth used to say cold sleep was a thief. It came friendly, soft-footed, then left with your life in its pocket. Charles must have seen her drifting, because he spoke. "Tell me about the school." She opened one eye. "What school?" "The one your mother wanted. The one you wanted." Annie looked toward the entrance. Dawn was still far, but the black outside had thinned a little. "There used to be Hollow Creek Elementary. not much to look at. Brick walls, old windows, heat that worked when it felt like it. But it was close. Kids could walk from half the holler. Teachers knew whose daddy drank, whose mama worked nights, who needed breakfast without being asked. What happened? Budget cuts first, then consolidation. They said bigger schools would mean better resources. Maybe on paper. But the new school is over an hour away for some kids. Bus comes before sunrise. In winter, roads ice over. Parents with no cars can't get there for meetings. Little kids fall asleep before spelling. Charles listened the way he had listened to the mountain at last. Not because he was waiting to respond, but because not listening had consequences. And you wanted to teach there, he said. I wanted to teach here. There's a difference. Yes, he said. There is. Annie turned her head. You sound like you understand, but you were about to build vacation cabins on land people still use. His face tightened. I know. Do you? I know more than I did yesterday. That's not the same as knowing enough. No, he said. It isn't. She appreciated that he did not defend himself. It made it harder to keep hating him cleanly. My company has done projects in poor areas before, he said. We always said we were bringing opportunity. Opportunity for who? Investors first, he admitted. Then guests. Then local jobs, if it worked out. If it worked out, Annie repeated. He looked ashamed. That sounds worse when you say it. It was worse before I said it. Water dripped from the ceiling between them. Charles rubbed his hands together, then held them near Annie's left hand without touching. Your fingers are shaking. So are yours. I'm 50. I'm allowed. I'm injured. I'm allowed more. Fair. A faint grayness touched the mouth of the hollow. Morning was coming, slow and wet. With it came another problem. Daylight would help them see, but it would also show how much mountain had moved between them and the road. Charles looked toward the entrance. At first light, we try for higher ground. If the slope holds, and if it doesn't, we wait. He nodded. I'm getting better at hating waiting. Good. Means you're alive. He was quiet for a moment, then said, when we get out, I want you to introduce me to Ruth. Annie gave him a side look. Why? I owe her thanks. For what? For teaching you what saved me. Annie looked away before he could see how that landed. Ruth would like that answer. She would pretend she did not. But she would. She'll make you eat, Annie said. I can manage that. No, you can't. She feeds people like she's settling a debt with God. I'll be respectful. You'll be full. For the first time all night, Annie smiled without meaning to. It was small, tired, and gone quickly. But Charles saw it. He did not point it out. He was learning. Then a sound came from outside. Not thunder, not water. A distant shout. Both of them froze. It came again, faint but human, carried through the trees by the thinning wind. Charles leaned forward. That was a voice. Annie listened, every part of her awake now. Another shout answered from farther off. Men. Maybe 2 or 3. Not close. Not safe yet. But real. Marcus, she whispered. You know? I know his call. Charles reached for his dead phone, then stopped. Signal? No. Voice carries funny in hollows. They may be above us. They may not hear us from here. What do we do? Annie looked at the branch-choked entrance, the mud, the water, the gray morning beyond. Her shoulder throbbed. Her legs felt weak. But the mountain had given them a thread. She turned to Charles. Now you get to be useful again. He straightened. Tell me. Your shirt. Tear off anything white. He looked down at what was left of it. This shirt cost $800. Annie stared at him. He lowered his eyes. Right. Stupid thing to say. Very. He started tearing fabric. Annie listened to the voices outside and prayed they would not fade before the mountain decided to speak again. Charles tore the shirt with his teeth because his fingers were too cold to work right. The first strip came loose unevenly. The second tore cleaner. By the third, the front of his shirt hung open beneath his ruined vest, and he had stopped caring what he looked like. Annie took the strips with her good hand, tied 2 together, then pointed toward a thin branch wedged near the entrance. Wrap it around that, high as you can reach. Charles crawled forward and tied the white cloth to the branch. It drooped in the rain. That won't be enough, he said. Not for seeing. For movement. What? If they see something moving where nothing should move, they'll look harder. He nodded, then tied another strip lower where the wind could catch it through a gap in the branches. The cloth snapped once, weak but visible in the gray morning. Outside, the storm had faded from rage to steady punishment. Rain still fell, but the trees no longer bent sideways. Mist moved through the broken slope like smoke. A voice called again. "Annie." Her eyes sharpened. "That's Marcus." Charles leaned toward the opening. "Here, we're here." His shout came back at them from the rock, swallowed by rain. Annie shook her head. "Wrong direction. Sound bounces in this hollow. Then how do we answer?" She looked at the stone walls, thinking. "Hit rock. 3 times. Pause. 3 times again. With what?" "Your shoe." He looked down at his one remaining Italian shoe, then at her. Annie raised an eyebrow. "You already lost the expensive car." "Fair point." He pulled off the shoe and struck the heel against the rock wall. The first hit was dull. "Harder," Annie said. He hit again. Crack. 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 He paused, then repeated it. The sound carried better than his voice, sharp through the hollow. They waited. Rain, water, wind and leaves. Then, faintly, from somewhere above, 3 answering knocks. Charles stared at Annie. She let out a breath. They heard. He hit the rock again. 3. Pause. 3. A distant shout followed, clearer this time. "Annie, you hurt?" Marcus Hale's voice came through the trees, rough and familiar. Annie closed her eyes for 1 second, and the relief on her face made Charles look away. It felt too private to watch. She cupped her good hand around her mouth. "Shoulder, Charles's ankle. Slope's bad." "A pause." "Stay put," Marcus shouted. "We're above you." "Road's gone," Annie muttered. "No kidding." Charles almost laughed, but his throat tightened first. "They found us. They found the hollow, not us safe." "Still." "Yes," she said. "Still." More voices moved above them, boots scraping, men calling to one another. A chainsaw started somewhere uphill, then cut off. Marcus shouted orders with the calm of a man who had spent half his life telling frightened people what to do while hiding his own fear. "Rope line," he called. "No weight on that lower bank. Earl, back up from that edge." "I said back up, not think about it." Annie smiled faintly. "That's Marcus. He sounds angry. He sounds scared. Around here, they're cousins." Charles shifted closer to the entrance. Annie grabbed his sleeve. "Don't. I'm just looking. You rich men ever notice how often just comes before something stupid?" He sat back. "I deserve that too? You're collecting them." Outside, loose dirt slid past the entrance. A small stone bounced into the hollow and landed near Charles's bare foot. He pulled back. From above, Marcus called, "We're sending a line down. Don't come out until I say." Charles looked at Annie. "Can they get you up with that shoulder?" "They'll make a sling." "You first." She gave him a tired look. "Don't start trying to be noble. It doesn't fit right yet." "I mean it. I know. That's why it's annoying." A rope dropped through the branches, landing against the fallen tree outside. It swung twice before catching. Marcus's voice came again. "Can either of you reach that?" Charles looked at the gap. The rope was close, but not close enough. He would have to crawl halfway out, across slick mud, and under the pinned branches. His ankle throbbed before he moved. "I can," he said. Annie studied him. "Maybe. I can. Listen carefully. Keep your chest low. Don't put weight on the mud near the right side. That's where water's undercutting it. Use the trunk, not the smaller branches. If anything shifts, you come back, rope or no rope." He nodded. "Say it back." He looked offended for half a second, then saw her face. "Chest low. Avoid the right side. Use the trunk. If it shifts, come back." "Good, go." Charles crawled out of the deeper pocket and toward the entrance. The cold hit him first, then the rain. He slid one hand onto the fallen trunk. Bark tore at his palm. He pulled himself forward, bad ankle dragging, barefoot scraping stone. The rope hung just beyond his reach. "Little farther," Marcus called from above. "Slow, sir, slow." Charles stretched. The mud under his left elbow sagged. "Back," Annie shouted. He jerked back just as the edge crumbled into the washout. Mud slid away, taking leaves and stones with it. The rope swung out, and then back again. Charles breathed hard, face inches from the ground. Annie's voice cut through the rain. You alive? Yes. Then stop making me repeat myself. A man above them let out a nervous laugh. Marcus snapped, quiet up there. Charles waited until the rope swung close again. This time he braced his knee against the trunk and reached with the torn shirt strip still around his wrist. His fingers caught the rope. He grabbed with both hands. I have it, he shouted. Don't pull yet, Marcus called. Tie off inside if you can. Charles dragged the rope into the hollow. Annie guided him to wrap it around a stone pillar in the deeper pocket. A natural brace Ruth had once called the mountain's thumb. Charles tied the knot badly. Annie made him redo it. Were you never a Boy Scout? She asked. My father tried. I lasted 2 meetings. Shocking. He redid the knot. Better this time. Marcus sent down a rescue harness, then a second rope. It took time. Everything took time when the ground could not be trusted. A young volunteer named Caleb slid partway down on belay, pale and focused, rain dripping from his helmet. When he saw Annie, his face changed. Lord, Annie, he said. I'm not dead, Caleb. I can see that. Then don't look so disappointed. His mouth twitched. Yes, ma'am. Charles noticed the ma'am and almost smiled. They secured Annie first despite her objections. Marcus insisted from above, and Ruth's name came with it. Your grandmother says if you argue, she'll climb down here herself, Marcus shouted. Annie closed her eyes. That woman fights dirty. The harness hurt. There was no way around it. Caleb and Charles worked together, trying to keep pressure off her shoulder. Annie bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, but she did not cry out. Charles saw that and wished she would. Silence like that felt expensive. Before they lifted her, Annie grabbed his wrist. You come up after me. I will. No hero nonsense. I thought nobility didn't fit yet. It doesn't, so don't try it wet and barefoot. He nodded. I'll come up. The rope tightened. Annie was pulled slowly toward the opening, then out into the gray light. Rain touched her face. Above, Marcus and 2 volunteers hauled with steady commands. Halfway up, the slope shifted under Caleb, and Charles's heart stopped, but the line held. Then Annie disappeared over the ridge. For the first time since the tree fell, Charles was alone in the hollow. The silence that followed was short, but it reached into him. He looked at the stone, the water, the torn strips of his shirt, the belt still holding the branch, the place where Annie had sat. He thought of how easily she could have left him beside the SUV, how reasonable it would have been, how many people in his world would have called it not her responsibility. Marcus shouted down, Mr. Whitmore, your turn. Charles crawled to the rope. His ankle screamed when Caleb helped secure him, but he held the sound behind his teeth. As they lifted him out, he saw the mountain from above. Old Mill Road broken in 3 places, his SUV, a twisted dark shape far below near Blackwater Run. Trees down like matchsticks, mud covering every path he had thought rescue could use. Annie had been right about all of it. At the ridge, hands grabbed him and pulled him onto wet ground. Men in yellow rain gear surrounded him. Someone wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. Someone asked his name. Someone else asked if he could stand. Charles ignored them for 1 second. Annie lay on a stretcher a few yards away, Ruth Carter kneeling beside her in a soaked gray coat. One hand on her granddaughter's forehead. Ruth was small, thin, and old enough to look fragile if a person did not know better. Charles knew better the moment he saw her eyes. He limped toward them. Ruth looked up at him. Whatever he had planned to say vanished. Mrs. Carter, he said, voice rough. Your granddaughter saved my life. Ruth held his gaze. I know. No surprise, no flattery, no gratitude that a rich man had finally noticed. Just the truth, standing straight in the rain. Charles lowered his eyes. Behind them, Blackwater Run roared through the broken valley, carrying pieces of road, tree, and pride down the mountain. The ride down the mountain did not feel like rescue. It felt like being carried out of a war that had started before anyone alive could remember. The volunteer crew moved slowly along the broken ridge. 2 men at the front of Annie's stretcher, 2 at the back. Marcus walking beside them with 1 hand on the rail and 1 eye on the slope. Ruth stayed close enough to touch Annie's foot whenever the trail widened. Charles followed behind with a blanket over his shoulders and a borrowed boot on 1 foot that did not fit. His ankle throbbed with every step. But he did not ask anyone to slow down. He had no right to ask the mountain for comfort now. Below them, Old Mill Road had split into pieces. Whole sections were gone, peeled away by water and carried down into Blackwater Run. Trees lay across the path like warning signs nobody could remove. The air smelled of wet leaves, torn roots, diesel from the rescue trucks, and the sharp metal scent of mud after a slide. Charles looked at the damage and felt a cold pressure behind his ribs. He had told Annie his people would come. He had believed it, because believing had always worked for him. But there was no road for them to come on. No helicopter could have lowered through those winds. No phone call could have stitched the mountain back together. Annie had not been dramatic. She had been accurate. At the lower staging area, 2 ambulances waited near a line of pickup trucks. The bridge beyond Miller's Creek was under brown water, so the county EMS had come from the north after clearing fallen trees with chainsaws. Men and women in rain gear stood around with coffee and paper cups, faces drawn from a night of work. Nobody looked polished. Everybody looked useful. When they reached the ambulance, a paramedic leaned over Annie. "Annie Carter, you stay with me now. Pain from 1 to 10? Depends who's asking," Annie said, eyes half closed. The paramedic smiled despite himself. "I'm asking." 8. Ruth leaned closer. "That means 10. Annie opened one eye. "Grandma, don't grandma me. I know you're lying numbers." Charles stood a few feet away, listening. It was the first time he had heard Ruth's voice clearly. There was no wasted softness in it, but every word had care under it. The paramedic checked Annie's shoulder and frowned. "Possible dislocation, maybe fracture. We need x-rays. Any head injury?" "No," Annie said. Ruth said. She slid near the washout. "Grandma, truth won't kill you, child. Pride might." Charles lowered his eyes. A second paramedic approached him. "Mr. Whitmore, we need to look at that ankle." "I'm fine." Annie turned her head on the stretcher. "No, you're not." The paramedic glanced between them. Charles exhaled. "Apparently I'm not." They sat him on the open tailgate of a rescue truck while the paramedic removed the borrowed boot and examined his swollen ankle. Charles watched Ruth climb into the ambulance beside Annie. She did it slowly, joints stiff, one hand gripping the door frame, but when a volunteer tried to help, she gave him a look that made him step back. Marcus came over, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. "Hospital's ready. Road north is rough but open." Charles nodded. "Thank you." Marcus studied him for a moment. "Thank Annie. We were looking for your vehicle first. Would have been too late if she hadn't left markers." Charles looked toward the ambulance. "I know. Do you?" The question was quiet, not rude, but it struck harder than accusation. Charles met his eyes. "I'm beginning to." Marcus did not smile. "Beginning something. Not enough, but something." The ambulance doors shut. Charles stood too quickly and pain shot through his ankle. The paramedic caught his elbow. "You're riding in the second ambulance," the man said. "I want to ride with her." Ruth's voice came from inside the first ambulance before the doors fully closed. "You can want from the other one." Annie's faint laugh followed, then turned into a hiss of pain. Charles stepped back. "Yes, ma'am." The words came out before he thought about them. Marcus's mouth twitched. "Smartest thing you've said today." The convoy moved slowly towards St. Agnes Regional Hospital. Through the ambulance window, Charles saw Hollow Creek in pieces. Flooded ditches, porches, stacked with sandbags. A church parking lot filled with families who had lost power. A diner with its sign half torn loose but coffee still being served inside. Men cleared limbs from the road. Women carried blankets into the church hall. A teenager in a football hoodie directed traffic with a flashlight. Nobody waited to be asked. Nobody sent a memo. They just moved toward need. Charles had built resorts in places like this and called them untouched. He had been wrong. The land was touched everywhere by people who knew it, repaired it, buried their dead in it, and kept living when outsiders flew away. At the hospital, nurses took Annie through a side entrance while Ruth walked beside the stretcher, still holding Annie's good hand. Charles was rolled in after them despite his objections. By then the news had begun to spread. A billionaire missing in the storm. A local girl injured. A landslide on Old Mill Road. People turned to look, but not in the way they looked at him in airports or hotel lobbies. Here, they looked past him toward Annie. That too was new. In the exam room, a doctor confirmed Charles had a bad sprain, bruised ribs, and mild exposure. Nothing that would not heal. He barely listened. Through the thin curtain, he could hear Ruth's voice in the next bay and Annie answering in short, tired sentences. Then another voice arrived in the hallway. Victor Langley. Where is he? Victor demanded, low but sharp. I need to speak with Mr. Whitmore immediately. Charles closed his eyes. Once, that voice had meant order. Clean clothes, waiting cars, controlled statements, problems reduced to language. Now it sounded like a door closing before anyone inside could breathe. Victor stepped through the curtain carrying a dry coat and a phone. His hair was damp but neat. Somehow he had found a way to remain pressed and composed, while half the county looked like it had crawled through the earth. Charles, he said, relief arranged across his face. Thank God. We've got a statement drafted. Weather accident, heroic work by local responders. Gratitude to the community. We'll keep the girl's name out until legal reviews exposure. Charles looked at him. Her name is Annie. Victor paused. Of course, Annie. We'll handle that carefully. There may be liability concerns if she inserted herself into a rescue situation without authorization. The room seemed to narrow. She saved my life, Charles said, and we are grateful. But gratitude and liability are different matters. Charles stared at the man he had trusted with land deals, negotiations, public risk, language. He heard Annie's voice in the hollow. You call it empty land because you never learned the names of the people living with it. Victor lowered his voice. There's also the development issue. We don't want local sentiment turning this into a referendum on the project. Best thing is to compensate the family privately and move on. Move on, Charles repeated. Yes, generously, quietly. From beyond the curtain, Ruth's voice cut through the hallway. If you're talking about my granddaughter like she's a pothole in your road, lower your voice or say it to my face. Victor stiffened. Charles almost laughed, but shame stopped him. Ruth had heard enough men like Victor in her life. She did not need introductions. Charles pushed himself upright on the hospital bed. Leave us. Victor blinked. Charles, we need... I said leave. The old tone was back, the one that ended meetings. Victor recognized it and stepped away, but not before his mouth tightened with something Charles had mistaken for loyalty for too many years. A nurse opened the curtain halfway. Mr. Whitmore, Miss Carter is asking if you're alive or still making trouble. For the first time that morning, Charles smiled without effort. Tell her both, he said. The nurse shook her head and disappeared. Charles sat alone after that, ankle wrapped, body aching, mind louder than the storm had been. He thought of the SUV sinking into mud, of Annie's hand pulling him away, of Ruth's eyes in the rain, of Victor saying the girl, because names made people harder to dismiss. A few minutes later, Marcus appeared at the curtain with 2 paper cups of coffee. Figured you take it black, Marcus said. I do. Figured wrong sometimes, but not today. Charles accepted the cup. The coffee was terrible and hot. He drank it anyway. Marcus leaned against the wall. Annie's going to be all right. Shoulders ugly, but doctor says no surgery if the scans hold. Charles let out a breath he had been holding for hours. Thank God. God and Annie. In that order, depending who you ask. Charles nodded. Marcus looked at him over the rim of his cup. Storm showed you something, didn't it? Charles stared into the coffee. More than I wanted to see. That's usually how mountains teach. Charles looked toward the curtain separating him from Annie's room. I owe her. Marcus's face hardened slightly. Don't make that sound simple. It isn't. No, sir. It isn't. Folks with money like to settle things fast. Check, handshake, picture in the paper. But some debts aren't asking to be settled. They're asking you to change. Charles did not answer. He had no defense left worth using. In the next room, Annie laughed weakly at something Ruth said, and the sound pulled Charles's attention like a rope. She was alive. He was alive. His car was gone. His road was gone. His certainty was gone. For the first time in years, Charles Whitmore did not know what came next. And for the first time in years, he suspected that might be the only honest place to begin. Charles did not see Annie again until late afternoon. A nurse had cleaned the mud from his hands, wrapped his ankle, and told him twice to stop trying to stand. Victor had sent 3 messages through hospital staff, then stopped when Charles told the nurse to block all non-family visitors. The word family had made him pause. He had no family waiting in the hall. No wife, no daughter, No one who would know how he took his coffee without asking an assistant first. Annie had Ruth. Ruth sat beside her granddaughter's bed like a guard at a gate. She wore a dry cardigan someone from the church had brought, but her shoes were still muddy, and she had refused to leave them outside the room. "Mud came in with my child," she told the nurse. "It can leave when she does." When Charles appeared in the doorway on crutches, Ruth looked him over once. "You supposed to be walking?" "No, ma'am." "But you are." "Yes, ma'am." "Then don't fall in here." "I'm tired." Annie turned her head on the pillow. Her right shoulder was strapped and braced, her arm held still against her chest. A bruise had begun to darken along her cheekbone. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, which angered Charles in a way he did not yet understand. The mountain had not made her small. The room had. The tubes, the gown, the white sheets, the machines that beeped like they owned the right to measure her. "You look terrible," Annie said. Charles stopped beside the chair. "I was going to say the same, but I'm learning." Ruth gave a small grunt. "Slow learner, but learning." Annie's mouth twitched. "Did Marcus talk to you?" "He did." "Then you got the sermon version." "I think I got the short version." Ruth picked up her paper cup of coffee. "Marcus doesn't have a short version. He just pauses so men can feel hopeful." Charles lowered himself into the chair near the bed. His ankle protested. He ignored it. "I spoke to Victor," he said. Annie's eyes sharpened. "The clean shoe man?" Despite himself, Charles smiled. "Yes, the clean shoe man. What did he want?" "To manage the story." Ruth set her cup down a little harder than necessary, meaning bury the parts that stink. Charles looked at her. "Yes." Annie watched him carefully. "And? I told him to leave." "That's not the same as stopping him." "No," Charles said. "It isn't." The answer seemed to satisfy her more than a promise would have. She had heard promises from people with better shoes than follow-through. A silence settled, but it was not empty. Outside the window, the sky had cleared enough to show strips of pale light over the hospital parking lot. Pickup trucks, EMS vehicles, and church vans filled the spaces. People moved supplies from one vehicle to another: bottled water, blankets, diapers, canned food. Hollow Creek had been hit hard, but it was already working. Charles looked out at them. "Do they always do that?" "Do what?" Annie asked. "Show up," Ruth answered. "When nobody else does." Charles turned back. "I used to think communities like this needed outside investment." Annie gave him a tired look. "We need bridges that don't wash out, schools that don't close, clinics with doctors, and internet that doesn't disappear every time it rains. If that's what you mean, fine. If you mean people buying what we still use and calling it opportunity, then no." Charles absorbed that. A day earlier, he would have heard insult. Now he heard instruction. "I saw the road from above," he said. "Old Mill is gone in 3 places. The bridge is underwater." "Been telling the county that bridge was too low for years," Ruth said. "But poor folks' warnings don't get urgent until somebody rich almost dies nearby." The words cut because they were true. Charles folded both hands around the top of one crutch. "I'm sorry." Ruth looked at him long enough to make him uncomfortable. "For which part?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Annie said quietly, "Good question." Charles nodded. "For not listening. For dismissing you. For coming here ready to take land I didn't understand. For trusting men who saw this place as empty, because they never bothered to learn who depended on it." Ruth leaned back. "That's a start." Annie's gaze stayed on him. "What happens now?" He knew she was not asking about him. Not really. She was asking about the land, the project, the men waiting to turn disaster into wording. "I don't know all of it yet," he said. "But the project stops until I do." Annie's face hardened. "Stops for a week? Until the news quiets down?" "No. Stops." Ruth studied him. "Victor know that?" "He will. He won't like it." "I know. Men like that don't lose money gentle." Charles looked toward the hallway where Victor had stood earlier with his polished concern and legal language. "No, they don't." Annie shifted, then sucked in a breath. Ruth stood at once. "You need pain medicine. I need everyone to stop staring every time I breathe wrong." "You breathe wrong, I stare." Charles rose halfway. "Should I call the nurse?" Annie closed her eyes. "Sit down before you become another patient." Ruth pressed the call button anyway. When the nurse came, she adjusted Annie's medication and checked the brace. Charles waited near the window, staring at the parking lot while trying not to overhear pain being managed in small, practical phrases. He thought of Emily then, of hospital rooms and monitors, of how money could buy specialists but not mercy. For years, he had hated helplessness so much that he built a life where it rarely reached him. Annie had lived with it close by and still moved toward danger. After the nurse left, Annie looked drowsier but still awake. Charles said, "You should rest." "So should you. I've slept in worse chairs." "No, you haven't." He looked at the visitor chair, vinyl cracked at one corner. "Probably not." Ruth picked up her purse. "I'm going to find some real food before this place feeds her more gray soup. Mr. Whitmore, if you bother her, I'll know." "I believe you." "You should." When Ruth left, the room changed. Annie looked at the ceiling. Charles stayed by the window, unsure whether to sit or leave. "You can sit," she said. "You're hovering like bad news." He sat. For a minute neither spoke. Then Annie said, "You meant what you said? About stopping the project?" "Yes." "Because you almost died?" "Because I almost died after you told me the truth and I ignored it." "That sounds like the same thing." "It isn't." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Fear can make a man generous for a day. Shame lasts longer, if he lets it." Annie turned her head. "Are you going to let it?" "I'm trying." She looked at him for a long moment. "Trying gets old fast if nothing changes." "I know." "Do you?" Charles nodded. "My company has files on this place. Land values, timber surveys, zoning maps, tourism projections. I read all of that. I never read one page about bus routes, flood deaths, school closures, volunteer rescue times. I didn't know because knowing wasn't profitable." Annie's expression shifted. "Not forgiveness, but attention. My mama used to say folks don't always lie with words," she said. "Sometimes they lie by what they leave out." She was right. She usually was. Charles looked at her braced shoulder. "What would she say about last night?" Annie's eyes moved to the window. "She'd say I used language Grandma better not hear." "Too late," Ruth said from the doorway. Annie shut her eyes. "Lord." Ruth came in carrying a paper bag that smelled like fried chicken, biscuits, and pepper. Church ladies arrived. Food got serious. Charles stood too quickly, winced, and sat back down. Ruth handed Annie a biscuit wrapped in a napkin, then looked at Charles. "You eat?" "I'm fine." "That wasn't the question," Annie murmured. "Don't fight her." Ruth handed him a piece of chicken on a paper plate. A man can be sorry on an empty stomach, but he can't think straight. Charles accepted it. "Thank you." They ate in the quiet way people do after a disaster, when food is not pleasure so much as proof that the body is still here. The chicken was warm, salty, and better than anything Charles had eaten at 3 charity dinners that month. Ruth watched him take a bite. "That's Mrs. Beals. Don't compliment it unless you mean it. She can smell false praise." "It's excellent," Charles said. "I'll tell her you survived with some sense." Annie smiled faintly. Charles looked at the two of them, at the paper plates, at the muddy shoes, at the hospital room filled with more truth than any boardroom he owned. He understood then that gratitude could not remain a feeling. Feelings were too easy. They passed with weather, pain medicine, and fresh clothes. Gratitude had to become a decision. His phone, newly charged by a nurse, buzzed on the tray beside him. Victor's name lit the screen. Charles looked at it. Annie saw. "You going to answer?" He picked up the phone, declined the call, and powered it off. "Not yet," he said. Ruth nodded once, as if he had passed a small test and should not get proud about it. Outside, Hollow Creek kept moving supplies under a clearing sky. Inside, Charles Whitmore sat with the girl who had saved him and the grandmother who had raised her, eating fried chicken off a paper plate while the future he had planned for their mountain began, quietly, to come apart. Charles turned his phone back on at 6 the next morning, because the hospital administrator needed a number for his discharge paperwork. By then, Victor had called 19 times. There were also messages from board members, attorneys, 2 assistants, his head of security, and a public relations firm he did not remember approving. The screen filled with words that had once given his life its shape. Urgent, exposure, statement, liability, investor confidence, land option, media control. He stood near the window in the small hospital room, reading none of them fully. Outside, someone had set up a table with coffee, bananas, and foil-covered casseroles. A boy no older than 12 carried bottled water to an old woman sitting in the back of a truck. No one paid him. No one had to. Behind Charles, Annie slept at last. Ruth sat beside her with a Bible open on her lap, though Charles could not tell if she was reading or watching him through the reflection in the glass. "You going to answer that man?" Ruth asked. Charles looked at the buzzing phone. "Victor again." "Yes," he said, "but not in here." Ruth closed the Bible. "Good. Bad manners. Bringing business into a sick room." Charles stepped into the hallway on his crutches. His ankle burned, but the pain helped. It kept him from slipping too easily back into the old version of himself. At the end of the corridor, near a vending machine humming under fluorescent lights, he answered. Victor did not greet him. "Charles, finally. We have a problem." Charles leaned against the wall. "Only one? This is not a joke. The story is spreading. Local outlets are calling Annie Carter a hero. Someone posted footage from the staging area. You're in the background looking like you crawled out of a coal pit." "I did crawl out of a mountain." "Please don't say that to reporters." "I'm not talking to reporters yet." "That's good. We need a controlled statement. Gratitude, severe weather, ongoing assessment." "We do not mention the development plans unless asked. If asked, we say the project remains under review." "It doesn't." Victor paused. "What does that mean?" "It means the project is stopped. We discussed this yesterday. You were exhausted. I'm still exhausted. I'm also clear. Charles, you cannot make a billion-dollar decision from a hospital hallway because a local girl pulled you out of the rain. She saved my life, and we will compensate her family, generously. But we do not restructure company strategy around an emotional event." Charles watched a nurse push an old man in a wheelchair past him. The man wore a Vietnam veteran cap and had a blanket over his knees. He looked at Charles's crutches, then at his bare, bruised face, and gave a small nod. The kind men give each other when words would be too much. Charles nodded back. Victor kept talking. "The land option expires in 48 hours. If we delay, the seller can reopen negotiations. Competitors will move. Investors will ask questions. We have already spent 2 years assembling this. And how many hours did we spend asking Hollow Creek what it needed?" Victor sighed. "That is not how development works." "I'm aware." "Then act like it." The words were sharp enough to show what had been hiding under Victor's polish. Charles straightened. "Be careful." "No, Charles. You be careful. You were nearly killed. That makes you sympathetic, but unstable. If you walk away from this project without board consultation, people will say you're making decisions out of trauma. They may not be wrong. There it was. Not concern. Leverage. Charles had used men like Victor for years because they understood pressure. He had forgotten pressure worked both ways. "Are you threatening me?" Charles asked. "I'm protecting the company." "From whom?" "From a sentimental mistake." Charles looked toward Annie's room. Through the open doorway, he could see Ruth adjusting the blanket over Annie's feet. The motion was small, practiced, and full of care. "No," Charles said. "The mistake was calling this land empty. The mistake was calling the people here obstacles. The mistake was trusting you to tell me the difference between value and price." Victor's voice cooled. "You should rest before you say something harder to repair. I'm done repairing the wrong things." He ended the call. For a moment, he stood there with the phone in his hand, breathing through the anger. The old Charles would have called legal next. Then finance. Then someone to measure risk. He still would, but not to hide. Not to smooth the edges until truth became harmless. Marcus Hale came around the corner carrying 2 coffees and a paper sack. "You look like a man who just fired himself from his own bad idea." Charles gave a tired laugh. "Not yet. Shame, it'd be a clean headline. You bring coffee to every injured fool in the hospital?" "Only the ones Annie saved. Small club so far." Charles accepted the cup. "Victor wants to keep the project alive." "Figured. Does everybody here know him?" "Men like that don't need knowing long. 10 minutes is plenty." They walked slowly back toward Annie's room. Marcus shortened his stride without mentioning it. Charles noticed and was grateful. At the doorway, Annie was awake, eyes on him. "You took the call," she said. "I did. And I told him the project is stopped." Ruth looked up. Annie did not blink. "Stopped like rich people stopped?" Annie asked. "Or stopped like, stopped?" Charles stepped inside. Stop like I'm going to put it in writing. Annie studied him. Writing matters to men like him? More than decency. Then use writing. I intend to. Ruth nodded once. Good. Words with ink can walk farther than words with breath. Marcus handed Ruth the paper sack. Mrs. Beale sent sausage biscuits. Ruth opened it and frowned. Only 3? Marcus shrugged. She said Mr. Whitmore looked like he needed humbling, not feeding. Annie laughed, then winced. Ruth touched her knee. Charles smiled, but his phone buzzed again before the moment could settle. This time it was not Victor, it was Margaret Ellis, chair of the Whitmore board. Charles answered on speaker after looking at Annie and Ruth. He did not know why he wanted them to hear. Maybe because too much had been said about their home in rooms where they had no chair. Charles, Margaret said, we've spoken with Victor. He says you're considering a pause on the Hollow Creek project. Victor is behind. A silence. Meaning? The project is cancelled in its current form. No resort, no private cabins, no purchase without community review. I'll send a formal notice today. That is a major decision. Yes. May I ask what changed? Charles looked at Annie. She waited without expression, but he could feel the weight of the question in the room. I did, he said. Margaret did not answer immediately. Charles continued. I drove into Hollow Creek thinking I could buy land because a map said it was available. I ignored local warnings, nearly died, and survived because Annie Carter knew the mountain better than every system I paid for. Then I watched her community rescue people with fewer resources than our company spends on a weekend retreat. We have been looking at this place wrong. Margaret's voice softened, but only slightly. She was still a board chair. And what do you propose? A full review of our land practices, starting here, emergency infrastructure support, road access, communications, a community trust for whatever happens to that land next. Annie's eyes narrowed at the word trust. Charles saw it. And, he added, no decisions without the people who live here at the table, Ruth murmured. About time somebody remembered tables got more than one side. Margaret heard her. Who is that? Charles said. Ruth Carter, Annie's grandmother. Another pause. Good morning, Mrs. Carter. Ruth leaned toward the phone. Morning. Don't let him wriggle. For the first time, Margaret laughed. Not much, but enough. I'll do my best. Do better than best. Best is what folks say when they plan to fail politely. Charles looked down to hide a smile. Margaret cleared her throat. Charles, send the written notice. We'll convene at noon. I'll be ready. He ended the call. Annie looked at him. You really doing this? Yes. Boards can push back. They will. Victor will fight dirty. I know. You might lose money. Charles glanced at Ruth, then at Marcus, then back to Annie. Last night I almost lost more than that. Annie did not look impressed, which he appreciated. That sounds good. Make sure it means something. It will. Marcus sipped his coffee. Noon meeting, huh? Yes. You need a place with internet? Hospital's spotty when everybody's calling kin. Annie said, Church Hall has a generator. Ruth nodded. And Pastor Bell has that new router his nephew put in. Works unless the Lord sneezes. Charles looked from one to the other. You'd let me hold a board call at your church? Annie's mouth tilted. Depends. On what? Whether you can sit in a folding chair without acting persecuted. Marcus laughed into his cup. Ruth stood and reached for her coat. I'll call Pastor Bell. Charles looked at Annie. You should rest. I'll rest when men stop making decisions about my home without supervision. You're injured. And you're new at listening. We all have burdens. By noon, Charles Whitmore would sit in a church hall that smelled of coffee, old hymnals, floor wax, and rain-soaked coats. He would face the people who expected him to protect profit first. Annie Carter would be there in a wheelchair, shoulder-braced, eyes clear. Ruth would sit beside her with a paper plate of sausage biscuits and the patience of a woman who had waited too long to be heard. The storm had moved east, but something larger was still breaking. This time, Charles knew enough to let it fall. The church hall looked nothing like a place where billion-dollar decisions were supposed to happen. The floor was scuffed from decades of potlucks, funerals, Christmas pageants, and children sliding in Sunday shoes when adults were not watching. A long table near the wall held coffee in silver urns, paper cups, sugar packets, and 3 casseroles wrapped in foil with names taped to the lids. Raincoats hung over chairbacks. A stack of hymnals sat on an old piano that was slightly out of tune. Near the bulletin board, someone had taped up a handwritten sign, "Storm supplies here." Under it were diapers, bottled water, flashlights, batteries, canned soup, and dog food. Charles sat at the end of a folding table with his wrapped ankle propped on an overturned milk crate. He wore a borrowed flannel shirt from Pastor Bell because his own clothes had been cut, torn, or ruined. The sleeves were too short. The collar scratched his neck. He had never been more uncomfortable in a meeting, and for once, that seemed appropriate. Annie sat to his left in a wheelchair, shoulder braced, face pale but alert. Ruth sat beside her with a paper plate balanced on her lap and a look that suggested she had come prepared to outlive every foolish word in the room. Marcus stood near the door, arms crossed, talking quietly with Pastor Bell, a broad man in his 60s whose gray beard made him look gentler than his eyes allowed. Charles opened his laptop. Pastor Bell's router blinked on the windowsill, taped to a stack of hymnals for height. "Will this hold?" Charles asked. Pastor Bell looked at him. "Son, that router held through last year's youth lock-in, with 23 teenagers watching videos at once. Your board will have to compete with the Lord's strongest test." Annie murmured, "Told you." At noon, the screen filled with faces. Margaret Ellis appeared first, composed, silver-haired, sitting in a conference room Charles knew too well. Then came two board members from New York, one from Dallas, the company's general counsel, the CFO, and Victor Langley. Victor looked clean, pressed, and angry enough to burn through the screen. Margaret spoke first. "Charles, we're all glad you're safe." "Thank you." Her eyes moved slightly. "I see you're not alone." "No, I'm in Hollow Creek. These are the people affected by the project we're discussing." Victor leaned forward. "Charles, with respect, this is a closed board call." Charles looked at Annie, then Ruth, then back at the screen. "Not anymore." The general counsel cleared his throat. "There are confidentiality issues." Ruth leaned toward Annie and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "That means they're fixin' to say something ugly and don't want witnesses." Annie kept her face straight. Marcus did not bother. Victor's mouth tightened. "Mrs. Carter, this is corporate procedure." Ruth looked at the screen. "Mr. Langley, I have buried a daughter, raised a grandchild, sat through county meetings where men used words like procedure until poor folks went home tired, and survived a storm your paperwork did not. Don't wave vocabulary at me." For 3 seconds, nobody spoke. Charles looked down at his notes. He had prepared bullet points: pause acquisition, suspend development, infrastructure review, community trust, legal exposure. They seemed bloodless now. Accurate, but bloodless. He closed the document. "I went to Hollow Creek to inspect land for Whitmore Mountain Retreat," he said. "I drove onto Old Mill Road after being warned not to. I ignored that warning because it came from Annie Carter, an 18-year-old local woman I chose not to take seriously. My vehicle failed. The road collapsed. Annie found me, warned me again, and I refused help because I believed my rescue team would reach me. They could not. The storm had isolated every route in." Victor cut in. "Charles, no one disputes that the storm was severe, but this level of personal detail is not necessary for—" "It is necessary," Charles said, "because every mistake I made on that mountain is the same mistake this company made on paper. We assumed our systems knew more than the people who live here. We assumed access because a map showed a road. We assumed empty because we did not bother to learn use. We assumed consent because resistance was inconvenient." Margaret's face did not change, but she stopped taking notes. Charles continued, "I am canceling Whitmore Mountain Retreat in its current form, effective immediately. No resort cabins, no private fencing around Blackwater Run, no purchase agreement executed under the existing plan." The CFO leaned forward. "Charles, the sunk cost alone is less than the cost of being wrong and continuing." Victor laughed once, sharp and humorless. "This is emotional. You nearly died, and now you're letting guilt rewrite strategy." Annie spoke before Charles could. "He didn't nearly die because of guilt. He nearly died because he didn't listen." Victor's eyes shifted to her. "Miss Carter, no one questions your bravery, but this discussion involves financial, legal, and operational realities beyond—" "Beyond me?" Annie asked. "That is not what I said. It's what you meant. People like you always put a fence around common sense and call it expertise. One of the board members coughed. Another looked down. Victor's voice cooled. With respect, you are a teenager recovering from an injury. You may not understand the complexity of regional development. Annie leaned back slightly, tired but steady. I understand a road that washes out because nobody fixed it. I understand children riding more than an hour to school because somebody called consolidation efficient. I understand a mountain people use for medicine, hunting, firewood, and rescue trails being described as underutilized because it doesn't make money for you yet. Maybe I don't understand your kind of development, Mr. Langley, but I understand what it costs people who aren't invited to the meeting. Ruth reached over and squeezed Annie's good hand. Charles watched Victor's expression. The man did not look ashamed. He looked inconvenienced. Margaret turned slightly toward her camera. Miss Carter, what would Hollow Creek need before any outside investment could be considered responsible? Victor said, Margaret, I asked her, Margaret said. Annie did not answer right away. She looked toward the supply table, the casseroles, the batteries, the church ladies sorting blankets, the men checking chainsaws outside the window. Then she looked at Charles. Ask them, she said. Margaret blinked. The community? Yes. Not as a courtesy after decisions are made. First, ask the parents whose kids leave before daylight. Ask Marcus what rescue time looks like when the bridge goes under. Ask Pastor Bell how many families use the church Wi-Fi because they don't have any. Ask my grandmother what plants grow on that land before somebody bulldozes them. Ask people what they need without already deciding what you want to sell them. Pastor Bell said softly, Amen. Marcus stepped forward. You want a list? Start with road reinforcement, bridge elevation, emergency radio coverage, a storm shelter, and a school closer than the next county's promises. At the word school, Charles saw Annie's face change. Not much. Enough. Margaret noticed too. A school? Ruth set her plate aside. There used to be one. Hollow Creek Elementary. Closed piece by piece, until it became easier for officials to say children could ride elsewhere. Elsewhere is always easy for people who don't have to send babies onto mountain roads before sunrise. Charles felt the room on the screen shift. It was not agreement yet. It was attention. Sometimes attention was the first crack in a wall. Victor saw it and moved fast. This is mission creep. We are not a public school district. We are a development company. If we start trading resort plans for civic infrastructure, investors will revolt. Charles looked at him. Let them ask why a resort company can spend millions creating artificial streams for guests, but cannot help a community protect real children from real storms. That is a slogan, not a strategy. No, Charles said. It's a correction. The general counsel spoke carefully. Charles, to be clear, you are proposing full cancellation? I'm proposing cancellation of the resort, transfer of the development option into a community land trust structure, and creation of a funded resilience plan. Legal can tell me how. Finance can tell me how much. Nobody on this call will tell me whether Hollow Creek deserves it. That question is settled. Silence followed. Then Margaret said, We'll need a formal vote. Call it. Victor stared. You cannot be serious. Charles leaned closer to the screen. Last night, I stood under a falling tree because I thought the world still had to make exceptions for me. Annie Carter shoved me out of the way. Consider this me moving before another tree comes down. Margaret called the vote. It did not pass unanimously. Victor voted no. 2 others hesitated before abstaining. But enough voted yes to suspend the project, authorize a full community review, and begin drafting a land trust proposal. When the call ended, nobody in the church hall cheered. People who had been disappointed by systems for years did not celebrate promises too quickly. Ruth stood, picked up her plate, and looked at Charles. That was a door cracking open. Don't mistake it for the house being built. I won't. Annie watched him. You said school. I heard school. That's not the same. No, Charles said. It isn't. She nodded, exhausted now that anger no longer held her upright. Good. Keep learning. Outside, the last of the storm clouds moved east over the ridge. Sunlight touched the wet church windows and caught on the handwritten supply sign, on the coffee urns, on the mud drying across Charles's borrowed sleeves. For the first time since he had driven into Hollow Creek, he understood that survival was not the end of the story. It was the debt that began it. The vote did not change Hollow Creek by sunset. The bridge was still low. The school was still far. The cell signal still came and went like a shy animal. Families still boiled water because the storm had pushed mud into old lines. And Mrs. Beale still had 3 cousins sleeping in her living room because a tree had split their roof. But something had shifted. People felt it before they trusted it. By late afternoon, word had moved through the town faster than the county alert system ever had. The resort was stopped. Charles Whitmore had sat in Pastor Bell's church hall wearing a borrowed flannel shirt and told his own board no. Annie Carter had been there in a wheelchair with one arm strapped to her side, looking like pain had knocked on her door, and she had told it to wait outside until business was finished. Ruth had told a corporate board not to wriggle. Marcus had put road reinforcement and emergency radios in the same sentence as money, and for once nobody laughed. At Miller's Gas and Grocery, men who usually argued about football stood around the coffee machine and replayed the story with more confidence than accuracy. I heard she made that board vote while still bleeding, Earl Miller said. She was not bleeding, Mrs. Beale said from the counter. She was bandaged. There is a difference. Still sounds tougher my way. Truth is tough enough, Earl. Don't decorate it like a Christmas porch. Annie heard this from the passenger seat of Ruth's old pickup the next morning when they stopped for gas on the way back from her follow-up exam. She wore a sling under a borrowed denim jacket and had dark circles under her eyes. The doctor had said the shoulder would heal without surgery if she behaved herself. Ruth had said, "That'll be the miracle then." Inside the store, everyone turned when Annie came in. She hated it immediately. Hollow Creek people were not strangers, not exactly. They knew what cereal Ruth bought when money was tight, who had fixed their porch steps for free, which families had lost power, whose cousin had gone north for work and never come home. But attention was still attention, and Annie had spent most of her life learning how to move through rooms without asking for too much of it. Mrs. Beale came around the counter first. She was wide-hipped, sharp-eyed, and carried affection like a weapon nobody could refuse. "Don't you stand there looking like you're waiting for permission," she said, then hugged Annie carefully on the good side. Annie stiffened, then let herself be held. "You scared us half to death," Mrs. Beale said. "I didn't plan it. That mountain doesn't care about plans." Earl took off his cap. "Proud of you, Annie." She looked down. "I just did what anybody should have done." "No," Ruth said from behind her. "You did what plenty would have found reason not to do." That ended the argument before it began. Charles arrived 10 minutes later in a black county SUV driven by Marcus, not one of his own cars. He stepped out slowly, ankle-braced, wearing jeans someone had bought for him at the dollar store and shoes that did not match his old life. A few people stared. A few pretended not to. Charles stood in the parking lot for a second, looking at the gas pumps, the cracked asphalt, the faded sign, the ridge beyond town. This was the place where Annie had warned him the first time. He remembered the way he had smiled at her, polite, dismissive, worse than rude because it had felt civilized. Annie watched him through the window. Mrs. Beale followed her gaze. "He coming in here?" "Looks like." "Good. I got coffee old enough to humble him." Charles entered without the automatic confidence Annie had seen before. He did not fill the room this time. He stepped into it. "Morning," he said. A few people answered. Not warmly, not coldly. Measuring. Earl nodded toward Charles's borrowed shoes. "Road treat you badly?" Charles looked at Annie. "Not as badly as I deserved." The room went quiet. Annie sighed. "You don't have to turn every sentence into a confession. I'm new at this." Mrs. Beale handed him a cup of coffee. "Drink that. It'll punish you without anybody needing to help." Charles took it. "Thank you." He sipped and managed not to flinch. Annie gave him credit for that. Marcus came in behind him carrying a folder. "Pastor Bell's opening the hall at 2. County road supervisors coming. School district sent a deputy superintendent. Whitmore Legal will be on video." Ruth snorted. "Deputy means the first person was scared." "Probably," Marcus said. Charles nodded. "My board authorized an emergency planning session. Listening first. Decisions after." Annie looked at him. "Whose words are those?" "Yours." "Then don't wear them out." "I won't." But by 2 o'clock, the church hall was full, and Annie realized how hard listening could be when everyone had waited years to speak. Parents talked about children standing in the dark for buses before dawn. An older man named Mr. Clay described missing dialysis twice because the bridge flooded. A young mother said she drove 12 miles to sit outside the library for Wi-Fi so her son could finish homework. Marcus laid out rescue response times with maps, not to impress anyone, but because numbers were harder for officials to pat on the shoulder and ignore. Ruth spoke about plants on the mountain, the old gathering trails, the places where people had buried ashes and memory without needing a deed to prove love. Charles sat at the front with a notebook open. At first, Annie thought he might be writing for show. Then she saw his face. He was not performing attention. He was surviving it. Victor joined by video, silent for most of the meeting. That did not last. Near the end, after a mother named Carla asked whether any land trust would protect public access to Blackwater Run, Victor leaned toward his camera. With respect, these concerns are broad and emotionally charged. We need to distinguish between community wishes and feasible commitments. The room changed temperature. Annie felt Ruth's hands settle on her knee, not stopping her, just reminding her she was injured. Charles spoke before Annie could. "Victor, mute yourself." Victor blinked. "Charles, mute yourself or leave the call. This is exactly the kind of unmanaged environment I warned." Charles reached over and ended Victor's connection. No one clapped. Hollow Creek did not clap for a door that should have been closed long ago. But Mrs. Beale whispered, "Well, look at him finding buttons." Annie looked down so nobody would see her smile. After the meeting, people stayed in small groups, talking around coffee and leftover biscuits. It was not trust yet. Trust had to be built like a bridge, with weight tests and inspections and repairs after storms. But people gave Charles their names. That was something. They told him which roads failed first, which families had children with asthma, which hills still had graves from the old black settlement that maps had erased. He wrote until his hand cramped. As the hall emptied, Annie found him standing near the bulletin board, staring at a faded photograph of Hollow Creek Elementary. Brick building, flagpole, children lined up in coats, teachers standing behind them. Ruth was younger in the picture. Lena Carter stood near the end, one hand on a little girl's shoulder. Annie recognized that child as herself, though she did not remember the day. "My mother loved that place," Annie said. Charles turned. "I didn't know you were there. You were looking hard. I'm trying to see what I missed." She moved closer, careful with her shoulder. That building leaked. Heat failed half the winter. Playground had more gravel than grass. But kids belonged there. What happened to it? Closed in pieces. First, fourth, and fifth grade moved. Then the library. Then they said enrollment was too low to justify repairs. Funny how things get too broken to save after nobody fixes them. Charles looked at the photograph. Where is the building now? Still there, empty, mold in one wing, roof's bad, gym floor buckled. Could it be restored? Annie stared at him. "Don't say things like that unless you mean to chase them." He looked at her. "I mean to chase them." She searched his face, looking for the old man in him, the one who heard community and translated it into publicity. She did not see him, but she did not let that comfort her too much. "Kids here don't need a rich man's apology with windows," she said. "They need teachers paid right, buses that run, storm shelter, internet, books that aren't older than them. A place where nobody talks to them like being from Hollow Creek is something to overcome." Charles nodded. "Then that's the list. That's the beginning of the list. Then we keep writing." Annie looked back at the photograph. Her mother's face had faded with time, but the shape of her smile remained. For a second, Annie felt 9 years old again, standing in a hallway that smelled of pencil shavings, cafeteria rolls, and floor wax, believing every child could grow if somebody bothered to make room. "What would you call it?" Charles asked. She shook her head. "Don't. I'm asking. Ask the community." "I will. I'm asking you too." Annie swallowed. The answer came before she could protect herself from it. Something that tells children they weren't forgotten. Charles wrote that down. Outside the church, the evening sun came through broken clouds and lit the wet road gold. Not clean, not fixed, just visible. Annie watched Charles fold the paper and put it in his pocket. Not his assistant's folder, not Marcus's file, his own pocket. It was a small thing, but after a storm, people learned to count small things. 2 weeks after the storm, Charles returned to St. Agnes with a check. Not a symbolic check for cameras, not one of those oversized boards rich men held at charity events while smiling beside people who had learned to smile back. This was a real cashier's check in a plain envelope, thick enough to change the life of the person holding it, and small enough to fit inside the pocket of his coat. Annie was in the physical therapy room when he arrived, trying to lift her right arm 3 inches higher than yesterday. Her shoulder burned every time she moved, and the therapist, a woman named Janice with silver hair and no patience for excuses, stood beside her counting like Mercy had a schedule. 7, Janice said. Annie's jaw tightened. That was 8. That was 7 with ambition. Charles stopped in the doorway. Ruth sat in the corner, knitting something blue, and watching both of them like a judge. She saw Charles first. You come to help or hover? I'm not sure yet. Then sit before you become scenery. Annie turned her head and saw the envelope in his hand. Her face changed before she could hide it. Janice noticed too. We done for today? Annie lowered her arm with relief she tried to disguise. If you say so, I do. Ice that shoulder, and don't let rich company make you tense. Healing muscles hate drama. Charles stepped aside as Janice left. Annie sat on the edge of the therapy table, breathing through the pain. She wore sweatpants, sneakers, and a faded Hollow Creek High sweatshirt with the cuff cut wider to fit over her brace. She looked 18 again, and somehow older than he could explain. Charles held out the envelope. I wanted to give you this privately. Ruth's needles stopped. Annie did not reach for it. What is it? A check. I guessed that part. It's for you, not the community plan, not the land trust, not the school review. You. Annie looked at him for a long moment, then at Ruth. Ruth did not speak. She had raised Annie well enough to know when a child had to answer for herself. How much? Annie asked. Enough to pay for college anywhere you want. Enough to fix your grandmother's house. Enough for medical care, transportation, whatever you need. Enough so you don't have to wait for committees to decide what your life is worth. The room went quiet except for the hum of a vending machine in the hall. Annie looked down at her hands. Her left hand lay open on her knee. Her right arm rested in the brace, useless for now, but healing. She thought of the roof at home, how rain found the same corner of the kitchen every hard storm. She thought of Ruth cutting pills in half near the end of the month and pretending it was because the doctor wanted it that way. She thought of tuition pages she had looked at on the library computer until the numbers made her close the browser. She needed that money. That was the cruel part. If she refused it, it would not be because she did not need it. It would be because she needed something else more. How much is enough? She asked. Charles frowned. What do you mean? Enough for me to leave? Enough for you to sleep better? Enough for newspapers to say you made it right? He flinched slightly. That's not why I'm offering. I believe you, Annie said, and that surprised him. But good intentions don't always know what they're carrying. Ruth set her knitting in her lap. Say what you mean, baby. Annie looked at the envelope again. If I take that, people will say this story ended clean. Poor girl saved rich man. Rich man paid poor girl. Everybody feels good. Hollow Creek goes back to patching roads with prayers and duct tape. Charles lowered the envelope a little. That isn't what I want. What do you want? He asked. Annie slid carefully off the therapy table. Ruth started to rise, but Annie shook her head. She stood on her own, a little unsteady, chin lifted. I want the school. Charles said nothing. Not a promise in a meeting. Not a feasibility study that dies in somebody's inbox. A real school here. Books. Buses. Teachers paid enough to stay. Internet that works when clouds show up. A kitchen that feeds children who come hungry. A storm shelter strong enough for families when the creek rises. A nurse 2 days a week. A library open after class so kids don't have to sit outside some building stealing Wi-Fi to finish homework. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Charles looked at the envelope in his hand. Annie, I can do both. Can you? Yes. For how long? Until the story fades? Until Victor finds a cheaper version? Until your board decides a plaque counts as a school? Victor is no longer leading this project. Men like Victor don't disappear. They change chairs. Ruth's mouth moved like she approved of that line but did not want to interrupt. Charles stepped closer, careful not to crowd Annie. I understand why you don't trust this. No, Annie said. You understand why I shouldn't. That stopped him. She took a breath. I don't want to be the only child who gets out. The words filled the room, plain and final. Charles remembered the photo in the church hall, the faded school building, little Annie standing near Lena Carter's hand. He remembered Ruth saying elsewhere was always easy for people who did not have to send babies onto mountain roads before sunrise. He remembered Blackwater Run roaring below Mercy Hollow and Annie's voice in the dark. "I hate waiting for people who may not get there." Annie pointed at the envelope. "That check helps me. A school helps children I'll never meet. If you really owe me, don't pay me to leave. Help them stay and still have a future." Charles looked at Ruth. Ruth lifted one hand. "Don't look at me for rescue," she said it plain. He turned back to Annie. "The board will fight the cost. Let them. The district will move slow. Push. The old building may not be salvageable. Then build higher. People will accuse me of buying redemption." Annie's face softened just enough to hurt. "Then stop trying to buy it. Earn it where nobody can cash it." Charles sat down slowly in the plastic visitor chair. The envelope rested in his hand like something suddenly too small. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "You were doing the easy right thing." He nodded. "And the hard one? Write the first check to the school fund. Put it where the board can't claw it back. Make the community part of the trust. Hire people from here to build it. Ask teachers what they need before architects draw something pretty and useless. And don't name it after yourself." A tired smile touched his face. "That last one was never my plan." "Good, one less fight. What would you name it?" Annie looked at Ruth, then toward the window. Outside, the parking lot was busy with ordinary life. A man helping his wife into a truck, a nurse smoking near the loading dock, 2 children sharing a bag of chips on a bench. Ordinary looked different after almost losing it. For every child they almost forgot, Annie said. Charles took out his phone. This time, he did not call Victor. He called Margaret Ellis. When she answered, he said, "Margaret, I need an emergency board resolution drafted today. Not a donation. A binding education and resilience trust for Hollow Creek." Annie watched him. Ruth picked up her knitting again. "Tell her roof better not leak." Charles covered the phone. "She says the roof better not leak." On the other end, Margaret was silent for a second, then said, "Tell Mrs. Carter I heard her." Charles looked at Annie and held up the envelope. "What should I do with this?" Annie took it at last. For 1 second, his heart lifted. Then she placed it back in his palm and closed his fingers around it. "Make it the first brick," she said. Charles nodded, and for the first time since the mountain had taken his car, his road, and his pride, Charles Whitmore understood the difference between giving money away and putting it where it could grow roots. 1 year later, the first school bell in Hollow Creek rang at 8:05 on a clear September morning. It was not a fancy bell. It did not come from Italy or hang in a tower designed by an architect who had never stood in mountain mud. It was an old brass bell Ruth Carter found in the storage room of the shuttered elementary building, wrapped in a stained towel and forgotten behind broken folding chairs. Marcus cleaned it. Pastor Bell polished it. Mrs. Beale said it still sounded bossy enough to wake children, which meant it would do. Annie stood near the front steps with one hand resting against the new brick wall. Her shoulder still ached when rain was coming. The doctor said it might always do that. Ruth said the body remembered storms the way land did. Annie had learned not to argue with either of them. The building behind her was not large, but it was solid. Red brick, wide windows, a library facing the ridge, a kitchen big enough to feed every child breakfast, and a storm shelter built into the lower level with reinforced doors, emergency radios, blankets, first aid cabinets, and space for families when Blackwater Run rose. There were classrooms with new books, not boxes of leftovers from richer districts. There was a computer room with internet that worked. There was a bus loop designed by people who knew how ice settled on mountain roads. There was a nurse's room, a music room, and a small garden where Ruth had already bullied 3 volunteers into planting mountain mint, elderberry, and bee balm. Above the entrance, carved into a wooden sign made from a fallen poplar, were the words, "The Annie Carter Mountain School." Annie had fought that name for 2 months. Charles had not fought back. He had only listened while the community board argued, voted, argued again, and voted the same way. Ruth said some honors were not for the person receiving them but for the children watching. Marcus said a girl who saved a stubborn billionaire and shook money loose from his pockets could survive a sign. Mrs. Beale said if Annie complained one more time, she would put her face on the cafeteria napkins. So Annie agreed on one condition. Under the school name, in smaller letters, the sign read, "For every child they almost forgot." That part mattered more. Children began arriving before the doors opened. Some came in clean sneakers that pinched because they had been bought a size too big to last the year. Some carried backpacks donated by churches 2 counties over. Some clung to grandparents. Some ran ahead, laughing because the bus ride had taken 20 minutes instead of 90. A little boy stopped at the front steps and stared up at Annie. "Are you the lady who pushed the rich man in a cave?" Annie heard Charles laugh behind her. She turned and saw him standing beside Marcus near the flagpole. He wore a plain navy jacket, no tie, no entourage. His hair had more gray than it had a year ago. Or maybe he had stopped hiding it. He walked with only the slightest stiffness now, but Annie noticed it when the weather changed. The mountain had left him a reminder too. "I didn't push him in a cave," Annie told the boy. "I pushed him out of the way of a falling tree." The boy looked disappointed. "That's not as funny." Charles stepped closer. "It was funny from where I landed." The boy looked at him. "Are you the rich man?" Charles nodded. "I was." The boy frowned. "You're not rich anymore?" Mrs. Beale, carrying a tray of biscuits toward the cafeteria, called out, "He's rich. He's just less foolish." Charles looked at Annie. "That may be the kindest review she's given me." "Don't get used to it," Annie said. Ruth came up the walk slowly, using her cane, dressed in her Sunday coat though it was Monday. She had insisted on wearing a hat with a small blue ribbon because Lena Carter had once worn the same hat to Annie's first school program. In her hand, Ruth carried the old wind chime from their porch, the one Annie's mother had left behind. Its metal tubes were scratched. One string had been replaced with fishing line. It was not pretty in any expensive way, but when the breeze touched it, the sound was clear. "You ready?" Ruth asked. Annie looked at the wind chime. "For what?" "You know for what. Don't make me explain ceremony to you in front of all these people." Annie took the chime with her good hand. Her fingers closed around it, and for a moment the crowd, the school, the speeches waiting in Pastor Bell's folder, all fell away. She was 9 again, hearing rain on the roof, watching her mother pack books into grocery bags for children who might not bring them back. She was 18 again, standing in Mercy Hollow with mud on her boots, screaming at a man who thought money could hold a mountain still. She was here now, older in places nobody could see, holding a sound that had once warned of storms. Charles stepped beside her, but not too close. He had learned distance could be respect. "I brought something," he said. Annie gave him a suspicious look. "If it's another check, I'll make Marcus tackle you." "It's not a check." He handed her a framed photograph. Hollow Creek Elementary, 30 years earlier. Children lined in front, teachers behind them. Lena Carter at the end, one hand resting on young Annie's shoulder. "We found the original in county archives," Charles said. Ruth helped identify everyone. Annie touched the glass over her mother's face. Ruth cleared her throat. "Don't cry on the frame. We just cleaned it." Annie laughed once, but her eyes burned. Charles looked at the school. "We put a copy in the library, with her name." "Thank you," Annie said. It was not the polite kind. It was the kind that had weight. Pastor Bell called everyone to gather. The flag rose. Children fidgeted. Older folks stood with hands over hearts, some singing, some mouthing words, some just standing because memory had its own language. Charles gave a short speech, shorter than anyone expected. "I came to Hollow Creek to buy land," he said. "Annie Carter taught me land is not empty, just because rich men haven't written on it yet. Ruth Carter taught me that warnings ignored become grief. Marcus Hale in this community taught me rescue is not a service you purchase after disaster. It is a promise people make before one comes. This school is not charity. It is a debt paid forward, and it belongs to Hollow Creek." He stepped back before applause could turn him into the center of the morning. Then Annie spoke. She had not planned to say much. She hated speeches. But when she looked at the children on the steps, at their new backpacks and restless feet, she knew they deserved words that did not sound borrowed. "My mama used to say children can feel what adults expect of them," she said. "If you give them leaking roofs, long roads, and old books, they learn to expect less. If you give them a place like this, maybe they learn the truth sooner than I did. That being from Hollow Creek is not something to overcome. It is something to stand on." Ruth pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Annie lifted the wind chime. "This belonged to my mama. It used to hang on our porch. When the wind changed, it told us to pay attention." I want it here because this school should do the same. It should remind us to listen before trouble comes. To children, to old folks, to the land, to people the world got used to ignoring. Marcus helped her hang it beside the front doors. A breeze came down from the ridge and touched the chime. The sound carried over the steps, across the bus loop, past the flag, through the open school doors. No one moved for a second. Then Mrs. Beale wiped her eyes and snapped. All right, children, inside before the biscuits get cold. The spell broke into laughter, shoes, backpacks, and the first noisy rush of a school day. Charles stood beside Annie as children streamed past them. You did this, he said. Annie watched a little girl stop to touch the library door before going in. No, we did. He nodded. Fair. She glanced at him. You're learning. Slowly. Better than not. Ruth walked through the doors behind the children, already telling someone the garden beds were too close to the downspout. Marcus followed with a box of donated notebooks. Pastor Bell argued with the microphone. Mrs. Beale shouted from the cafeteria that nobody was allowed to call those biscuits store-bought without repenting. Life entered the building all at once. Annie stayed outside a moment longer. Across the valley, the mountain stood green under the morning sun. Somewhere beyond the trees, Old Mill Road had been rebuilt higher and stronger. Blackwater Run moved quietly, as if it had never roared. Mercy Hollow was still there, hidden in rock and laurel, holding the memory of a night when pride fell, a tree came down, and a girl refused to let a man die just because he had not yet learned how to listen. The wind chime sounded again. This time, it did not warn of a storm. It welcomed children home. The lesson of this story is that true wisdom does not always come from wealth, power, or education. Sometimes it comes from the people the world ignores: the poor, the quiet, the ones who know hardship by heart. Annie teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act when someone's life depends on it. Charles learns that money can buy comfort, but it cannot buy humility, respect, or a second chance. The story reminds us to listen before it is too late, to value people beyond their status, and to understand that real gratitude is not shown through words or money alone, but through actions that help others build a better future. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.